Ladies and gentlemen, today is April the 26th, 2026, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
How's it going?
That's going all right. Can you hear me?
Yes, did you recover from the subway debacle?
You still remember that, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm feeling better.
Good. Do you expect you to make a full recovery?
I'm pretty sure I'm already there.
Very good.
It's all good.
Good. If I were to kind of share a story of my own misdeeds when it comes to eating things in the wrong order and the wrong quantities, would be a Christmas kind of week leading up to Christmas party where there are a bunch of people over and visiting. And I tend to be more of a night owl, so I wake up late relative to people. And people are already up and doing stuff, and they're making eggnog, and the alcoholic kind, where they have some eggnog, like nog mix base, and then they put alcoholic spirits in it, so it's got different flavors and so on, and it's booze. They're also having chips and queso. So I start off where normally I would have a bowl of oatmeal with fruit and protein powder, and then coffee, which is like pretty healthy. I wake up and I have alcoholic eggnog and chips and queso. And I threw up many times for a few hours. That's like one of the most upset I've ever made my system. And I swore an oath, like a paladin swears an oath, that I would not have alcohol before I had my coffee. So if I ever wake up and I'm offered alcohol because whatever, I overslept or something, I will not have alcohol before the coffee, because if I do, my system will reject it and punish me for it. So
Learned the hard way, huh?
yeah, I don't have alcohol very often these days, which it makes the advertisements that I get for non-alcoholic alternatives very funny. It's like, I get this great buzz after work, but it's not even alcohol. And it's like, okay, but I'm not looking for an alcohol-esque experience. So I don't need this replacement for something I don't want. But
Sure.
social drinker, maybe I'll have something like once every couple weeks or once a month if other people are out having beverages. Or if there's like wine pairing with meals where they've intentionally paired beverages with courses. Fuck yeah, I'm down. We ball. So the fine food and cuisine and so on. The Dota grind continues. I've been climbing a good bit. I got into Ancient 4 again, which is pretty close to my former peak of Divine something. So we're getting there. Played a few games today. The community is as toxic as ever.
Still putting up with it, huh?
Yeah. I don't mind. I just imagine that everyone who lashes out was verbally abused in the home growing up. And then I feel more pity and sympathy rather than anger at them. Because a lot of these behaviors, like, people think of themselves as pretty clever, but we echo a lot of what other people do around us. Like, not always knowing that this was an echo of someone else's saying or someone else's behavior, and I am now replicating that behavior in my own behavior. That can either be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the example that was set. And the parents that you're dealt, it's kind of RNG. You didn't choose your parents at a loading screen, as far as I know. So I can't hold someone else too harshly for the parents they got. I got pretty much aces for parents. Stable parents, loved each other in the home, continue to love each other even today. Never yelled at each other, and never yelled at me. Unless it was like from the other side of the house of, it's your turn to vacuum, or something, which is not that scary for a child. It's just like, okay, I'll vacuum. So yeah, I guess that's why I don't get mad at people who are toxic. I just feel bad for them of not having a good mother and father, or whatever. They probably
More
had
power to you.
extraneous circumstances that resulted in their instability. I had good parents, and I also had good football coaches in Texas that taught me about toughness, being a part of a team, agreeing to the rewards and the punishment of the team. So if the football team wins the event, then everybody is a winner. But if one student disrespects a teacher, everyone is punished. I don't know what other schools did that, but yeah, if someone ever backtalked a teacher or something, and the football coaches found out about it, then every student who was in the football program would be punished altogether. And that added a lot of social pressure on students among students of, you better not make us do this because we don't want to work out because of your fuck-ups. So we only really had probably like, I would say maybe 2 or 3 bullies who would actually talk back at teachers or do bully behavior to other guys. Most people were pretty respectful. So it seemed like that method worked. It's definitely a particular method, but yeah, some people got no method growing up. That's what I'm getting at. No method of moderating bad behavior, because bad behavior was the norm.
Yeah. Yeah, that's tough.
Yep, Dota grind continues. Starcraft stuff is good. Games are still entertaining. It's definitely a game that's been around for a very long time, but there's still a lot of demand to watch ladder, because the opponents that I get are pretty different from each other, so I don't usually get bored of lack of variety. And the gameplay is pretty fun right now. It's very mechanically based, so if you want to be a good StarCraft player right now, you need to be fast. You need to be building a lot of stuff very fast. It's less about the treachery and more about the fundamentals of how fast is your keyboard mouse control. Like, how hardcore of a gamer are you in that sense? In the beginning of StarCraft 2, it was more so like, if you knew one really good gimmick, no one else could stop you because they had never practiced against it because it's a brand new game. So if you knew about stealth units, you were automatically a Masters player, because that's pretty high up the tech tree, and many people didn't even tech up that far. Whereas now it's very standard to take 3 to 4 bases and tech up to at least tier 2, maybe tier 3 in most games. So the current StarCraft player is very advanced. That makes for fast-paced, fun games, but it's not quite as strategic. It's more so mechanical.
Gotcha. So they're still updating it at least, though, right?
Yeah, we get new maps every few months, which is cool. Like, maybe every half a year, it feels like. And they're all community-made maps, so the Blizzard devs are not making StarCraft maps anymore, but other people are. And we joke about there being one intern who just sticks stuff in the computer via USB, and they flip a switch, and that's about it. But yeah, the maps have been rotated pretty freshly, so it doesn't feel too repetitive in that sense. And it's pretty balanced. The better player normally wins. Everyone complains. Like, that's a standard pastime, is complaining about the balance of an RTS. But in an actual sense, the 3 factions are balanced extremely well, where if you outclass a player, you can just dumpster whatever faction in the game. It doesn't matter. The best players in the world, they're pretty consistent in their results regardless of the balance patches as well. They kind of have their own pecking order, almost. There will be certain phases where the qualifying brackets are very heavily representing one faction. Like, for the past few years, it's been Protoss players are very heavily represented in Grandmaster League, and then in a lot of the online money tournaments. There are just way more of them relative to Terran and Zerg. So they attribute some of that to the mechanical ease of Protoss. The late game army is very slow and moves together as a blob very efficiently. So you don't really need to split your army into multiple groups. And they're very good at turtling as well. So they're not obligated to be aggressive in the same way that Terran is more so obligated to be aggressive against their matchups.
Gotcha.
Yep, they're
So
very good.
StarCraft 3 when?
That's the big question for a lot of people, but to me, when I look at StarCraft 2, it doesn't look dated. It doesn't look like it's behind the times and in a previous era. Uh, to the contrary, like the new RTSs that were made, almost no one was saying that they looked better and newer than StarCraft 2 does. And StarCraft 2 is pretty... It's not very well optimized for CPU. Like, it very heavily tanks the CPU due to all the different units in the game and so on. But the way that the units look by the art and the crispiness against the landscape looks very, very good. The units are distinct. They're easy to read in most cases. They look different from each other. They look epic and cool in some way, so they're fun to look at. And they have a lot of personality with their voice lines as well. So they're very heavily stacked with unique, readable units against the landscape that have a cool art style. Having a good art style is expensive too, and StarCraft 2 was made back when Blizzard was like the big money studio that was making these crazy classic games that just created genres and dominated the market, like WoW and Warcraft and StarCraft 1. So throwing a lot of resources at stuff is something that the upstart RTS studios haven't been able to do. So I wouldn't think StarCraft 3 would happen for maybe another 5 to 10 years.
So they're going to stick with 2 for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, Microsoft did buy StarCraft stuff. I think they own the IP now, so they could do something. They definitely have the resources to do so. It depends on if they feel like it's a worthwhile investment.
I haven't really seen them do anything with the IP they got yet, though. I think they just added it to their, what's it called? The Battle Pass? Whatever that is.
Yeah, the Battle Pass added a lot of players too. So that was a non-zero contribution that did add life to the game, and they have been updating things like they fixed bugs where you couldn't upload things to the arcade anymore, and the arcade scene spoke out and they did fix that. So they are actively responding and doing stuff, but they aren't really throwing money generation into the game. Because I feel like if you just randomly told me, okay, Neuro, now you're the CEO of Microsoft and we're asking you to see if you would add something to StarCraft 2. The first thing that would come to mind for me would be a skin bundle for each faction that has certain units that are just you grind them in the game to unlock them, so they don't cost money, but then you can buy the bundle of basically a skin of every unit for the faction. And that would make me come back. If I wasn't playing StarCraft, I would probably play for a little bit to unlock those things and just make sure I had them on my account because they're cool. And they're like limited time or whatever. So that would be something that I feel like would bring a lot of players back. Just something fresh and collectible to bring the nostalgia back. I don't think those were super profitable for them based on how much it costs to make the skin sets. But yeah, the game is still very functional, very good, runs well. It's more stable than new games are. So it's not behind the times. The issue is novelty. There's not novelty in StarCraft 2 anymore. There's repetition and there's a classic, and it's like chess in a certain way, where it's still the premier RTS of, if I want to prove that I'm a better like 1v1 hardcore gamer than you, this would be the place to do so. Or StarCraft 1, but that's more like juggling old technology. So yeah, StarCraft 3, my prediction, 2035. Ish.
Gotcha.
People came back 10 years later for Classic WoW. So you might look at the end of the lifetime of StarCraft 2's updates and then do 10 years from that. Wild guess. Off the cuff guess. I think there's maybe a StarCraft FPS thingy that's being developed. People have been talking about. I don't know about this, but could be cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you could do with the IP if you wanted to be creative, but it doesn't seem like any company that's owned it in the past couple decades has wanted to do that.
Yeah, it's a pretty niche market compared to, say, mobile games. So a person who wants profit in the short term and growth in the long term would invest in a mobile game, because the number of players in the mobile game scene is way, way higher than PC gamers. That's much more niche market. And then if it's like a high skill-based game that's also not a social game, that's a pretty hard sell for an investor.
Yeah, I remember they were trying to do that third-person shooter with Nova back in the day.
Starcraft
They ended up
Ghost.
canceling. Is that what it was? Starcraft Ghost.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, but they actually made that though, right? That was like a spin-off of StarCraft 2.
I don't think they did. Chat, did they do that? I don't think it was completed.
Yeah, there was one that was not completed, but then they had some DLC for StarCraft 2 that they did complete. Covert Ops.
Oh, that's an expansion in StarCraft 2.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the one that I was thinking of was the Ghost that you mentioned, StarCraft Ghost. Yeah, I think that was where Nova originally came from, if I'm not mistaken.
StarCraft Battle Royale? That would be very funny. You get dropped onto an island with other people who chose a StarCraft unit to spawn as, and you try to fight to the last. That would be crazy. Write that down. Good idea, Chad.
I think they actually did make a Final Fantasy Battle Royale, but it didn't really receive much attention, so it kind of came and went. I was surprised to hear about it. I'd had no idea.
Huh. I didn't know about that either.
Case in point. Well, video games aside, was there anything that you wanted to talk about?
The only thing that stood out in world news... Oh, I guess here's a random wholesome story. Because some people struggle with the despair of news. There was a woman who is standing kind of on the bridge in this city, and she's really not having a good time contemplating jumping off the bridge. She's on the other side of the railing. And as she's thinking about this and stuff and grappling with her life up to that moment, who walks toward her but John Bon Jovi from the amazing rock band Bon Jovi. And he's just chilling here filming a video. He goes over to her, he talks to her. She calms down, decides to kind of step back from that ledge, and continues with her day and is fine. So good job, John Bon Jovi, not being an asshole and helping that lady. Clap.
Oh, well done. Was this a recent thing?
No, this happened in 2024.
Okay. Yeah, more power to him. Do you remember what city that was in?
I do not.
Bon Jovi. Nashville.
Nice.
Huh. Was there any news item beyond that you wanted to get to?
Well, there's one obvious one. How about you guess what it is?
Oh, right. There's the shooting.
Yeah.
What was that? Yesterday? Last night? Yeah. I mean, we don't really have any information about it yet, so I mean, I can't really comment on it. It's not as though we have any shortage of crazed gunmen in the United States. So until we get more details, I can't really add much color to it.
When someone asked about it in chat, if I'd heard about it, I sarcastically replied, "What? There's gun violence in America? No. But I don't think anyone was killed, right? I didn't see any news about it really.
Early on, I read somewhere that the gunman had been killed, but then I read later that he wasn't, so I don't know what the deal is with that. I do know that his plan was stupid. He literally thought he was just going to run past all of the security and just get into the main room where they were having the dinner. Not really sure what the thought process was there. Did you see the footage of him trying to run by everybody?
No.
Yeah, they had some security cam footage of him trying to get past the checkpoint.
Was he a very fast person?
Yeah, he looked pretty fast on camera. He didn't make it very far, though, unsurprisingly. Yeah, we'll see what comes of it. But for the moment, it's just not enough information. We'll know more soon, I expect. So nominal assassination attempts aside. What else?
There is I guess a South Dakotan issue with our next governor election. I can't remember if I told you this already. There are multiple candidates running for governor here who are talking about trying to eliminate property taxes entirely and have higher sales taxes. I don't know if you've heard anything about that or know, like, economically how feasible that would be.
Yeah, you mentioned it last time, I think.
Okay.
As far as feasibility, probably not sales taxes alone could replace it. It would be smarter just to have multiple different revenue sources replace it so that you could minimize the distortionary impact of any one individual tax. Yeah, sales tax is kind of rough because if you really hike it a lot, then it has big distortionary effects. So that's kind of why property taxes became preferable, the preferred alternative in the first place. Somewhat less distortionary overall to the overall economy. Yeah, in general, economists kind of recommend value-added taxes, like what they have in Europe. But that's not really feasible in the United States for technical reasons, basically legal reasons. So VAT is kind of off the table, at least at a national level. I'm not sure about a state level. That might be tricky. But I've never heard anybody talk about a state level VAT regardless. So it's almost always either income taxes, sales taxes, and or property taxes. That seems to be the main ones for US states. But yeah, you can totally do it. It's just a matter of public tolerance for what you try to replace the revenue with or how you offset it with government spending cuts. And I would imagine in South Dakota's case, there's probably not a lot of government spending anyway. Probably relatively modest in terms of government spending. So I don't imagine it would be too difficult to find new revenue sources. And I think it's a big energy state. So hypothetically, if you wanted to, you could probably offset a good chunk of that with some kind of arrangement with big energy companies. Some kind of royalties arrangement like what Alaska has, or some special fee or surcharge you could apply. Yeah, when it comes to finding alternative for property taxes, it's more a matter of creativity. It can definitely be done. It just depends on what
Just has to come from
boundaries.
somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah. How you want to do it in public will. Texas got a lot from its energy companies back when its economy was much more dependent on oil and gas. But then when the oil prices crashed in the 80s, it became apparent that that was not a good idea. They very quickly learned the hard way that it's better to have a diversified economy and by extension, a diversified tax base. Has there been any traction on that, or are they still just talking about it?
They're just talking about it. It would basically, we'll have to find out whenever one of those candidates wins, like what they actually are able to do with it. Because there are lots of advertisements talking about that as the major reason for why you should vote for me. So, yeah, I don't know. They don't go through really great detail of, okay, this is how we're going to implement it. This is where the money's going to be coming from. The new money that we're getting, since we're not getting property tax money. And then also, these are maybe the services that we might cut, because you could also cut spending to do that. So,
Gotcha. Have you gotten out and about among the state lately?
I have not.
Gotcha.
We're getting a ton of snow now because they tend to get the most precipitation in April. And it's not as cold as it is in other months by the absolute temperature, but because there's not precipitation in the coldest months, for whatever reason, we have it just cold enough to snow now, and we get a lot of precipitation. So we've had maybe 4 days of snow this week. And this is the most snow we've gotten all winter, by far.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, we had some thunderstorms here recently, but definitely wasn't all that bad overall.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not the worst in months. Is your power holding up?
Yep, we haven't had issues with that. We haven't had as high winds as that experience either, so.
That's good.
Yep.
I'm sure that was an exciting, what was it, 48 hours, 36 hours?
Yeah, I think closer to 48.
Gotcha. Well, the only item I had here was really Iran, and it's probably the smallest update yet. There's not really a whole lot happening there on account of the ceasefire and the on-again, off-again peace negotiations. So we can kind of freewheel today, wherever you want to go.
Sounds fun to me. Chat, let us know if there's a topic or country that you'd like to discuss. We do take questions.
Ooh. Did I tell you I beat Death Stranding?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I finally finished it.
Good work. How would you rate the game 1 to 10? 10 is the best.
I liked it. I think like 7 or 8 for me, but man, your mileage with Hideo Kojima is gonna vary significantly from person to person. Yeah, he's definitely got his own distinct style, and it's not for everybody. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating example of cultural fusion, because the way he presents America and American characters in his story is a little bit uncanny valley, right? You can tell they're supposed to be American, and they kind of sound American, but there's always a little something off about the way they talk and act. And I think that stems from the fact that he actually writes the scripts in Japanese and then just has them translated later. So they're mostly American, but it's kind of American behavior and speech through a Japanese prism. Yeah. Most of the time, not too noticeable, but every so often, yeah. you kind of notice it.
I see.
So if you like Hideo Kojima, you like crafting, and you like visual novels, you'll probably like Death Stranding, but you might be a little wary otherwise.
I see. Death Stranding, 2019.
Yeah, the sequel came out apparently last year on the console, PlayStation, and then it was released on PC just recently.
Oh, Death Stranding has a 9 out of 10 on Steam.
Well, that's, again, mileage will vary. I don't know how much I would trust ratings. Well, we could just jump into the Iran update and kind of get it out of the way.
We have a couple questions already off the bat.
Oh, okay.
The first question is a larger scale question. Chatter is asking, how do I take over the world?
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
Short and sweet.
Yep.
Okay. How do you take over the world? I mean, the real answer is you don't. Nobody controls the world. Never has, probably never will. Probably the closest you can come is to be the president of the United States. Because the United States does kind of represent a de facto global police state, in a sense. You know, the U.S.'s various security institutions have a global remit, and they exert de facto global jurisdiction. So, given that the president is technically in charge of that apparatus, being president is likely as close as you can get right now to running the world. But that still comes with significant limitations. You know, there's a lot of stuff that even the most powerful man in the world just can't do. So yeah, I don't think anybody can realistically run the world. World's too big, too complicated. Yeah, it's just not practical.
It seems like one of the key ingredients is having a sort of cult of personality, a really distinct and charismatic persona that people of all education levels can be compelled to be excited by. So that would be, I think, a fundamental to your plot to take over the world. The more charismatic and charming you are, the more steps you can skip in getting them to work for you and do stuff for you.
This is a valid point, but the issue is that even if you manage that, there's not any single office that you could win with that kind of public support that would give you the power to run the world. Like the presidency of the US is the closest you get.
Yeah.
Nothing else even comes close. So if you really wanted to run the world, I guess you could say that one of the top items on your agenda, besides getting broad-based public support, probably in a multitude of different countries, is that you would have to create institutions of global governance which you could use to actually de facto control and or govern the world. And as we've seen over the past century, there's a whole variety of powerful political actors in virtually every country on Earth that are very, very opposed to the creation of such institutions. We can't even get SDRs off the ground. Even though there's some support for that. Have you heard of SDRs before?
No, what are SDRs?
It's a special drawing rights. It's a hypothetical artificial IMF currency that could act as a de facto global currency. It technically exists right now. The IMF uses it as a kind of special emergency currency to help out countries that really need it. But its limitation is pretty limited. You know, they generally don't use it that much. But it has been proposed that SDRs could be scaled up significantly and be used as a de facto global currency, generally by countries that want to displace the US dollar, or maybe technocrats who like the idea of a global currency, since that would significantly ease frictions that inhibit global trade, since you wouldn't have to worry about currency fluctuations, hedging against the risk thereof, etc. It's just kind of easier. So, there's not a lot of support for it, but there's non-zero support for it too.
Mm-hmm.
Academically and to a lesser degree politically. And if you did have a global government, that would probably be something they would seriously think about. But as is, it's no go. Nobody really wants to go that far.
Mm.
So that proposal has remained de facto frozen for more than a decade. Yeah, real, true global institutions are basically impossible to construct right now. There's just too much opposition from existing nation states that don't like the idea of sacrificing their sovereignty to some other supranational entity that could hypothetically boss them around and make them do stuff that they don't want to do. Shit, even the European Union has problems with that, and they're way less ambitious than any kind of global government that might be constructed.
Mm.
So you're right that building public support would definitely be an early step, because that would give you some degree of political capital that you could use to construct global institutions of this variety. But it would be a heavy, heavy lift.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, I don't really think it practical. Let's see, what else did we have? Well, there was a question from last week we didn't get to. Do you think the US-Iran war is justified? In order to judge whether or not it's justified, you would have to know why it was being fought. And the Trump administration has been very, very cagey about that. So I think it's almost impossible to tell whether, it's justified without knowing, like, the real reason. I can speculate. I've tried to offer explanations as best I can since we've been talking about it, since we started talking about it more than a month ago, based off of available evidence. But, all of that has had to be speculation, because just nobody knows what the real rationale was, what the real impetus was. So hypothetically, it could be if they had some kind of special intelligence that they were moving towards a nuclear weapon, or maybe that they weren't serious about negotiating some kind of resolution. Like, I don't know. Maybe they have something. It's hypothetically possible. But I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that thus far. It kind of just seems like Trump got overly ambitious and got in over his head, and is now trying to kind of rectify that. So yeah, it's open to debate. I don't really have a fixed position on it. I would need more actual information. I'm pretty dubious that he had a good reason given what I know now, but who knows what other information there is. Let's see.
We do have 4 questions so far from chat as well.
Gotcha.
Chat, if I miss your question, feel free to tag me again. I have 4 questions.
Let's see. News in Mali. Actually, I did see that. The defense minister has been killed, and junta attacking towns across the country. Yeah, so this is a rebel offensive that was launched a couple days ago, nationwide in Mali. I think in the north it's mostly ethno-nationalist Tuareg militias. But then they have allies whom are Islamists. I think I have their names somewhere. Let me look that up. Yeah, their allies are Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin. JNIM, apparently an Al-Qaeda affiliate. And so while the ethno-nationalists are mostly focused on the north, where the Tuaregs are a majority, the JNIM has launched an offensive nationwide, and they've been hitting targets even in the south, where there's not a lot of Tuaregs. And apparently they did successfully attack the household of the defense minister and successfully kill him. So it's a big attack here. Well, series of attacks, really. It's got the government off guard. I don't know if this will be enough to overthrow the government, though. Their rebels in Mali have been pretty successful in the past. They've actually managed to seize a good chunk of the country in the past. At one point, they were on the verge of launching an attack on the capital, but they were eventually pushed back. So I don't know if this is like that, where they're making tangible gains that are threatening the government, or if this is just a series of well-planned raids across the country, in which case things will probably regress to mean within the next week or two. We'll see. But at the least you could say this is evidence that the government's approach to dealing with the problem is not very successful or impactful. And by extension, you could say that, in so much as that's true, that it's evidence that the assistance that the Russian government has been providing implicitly through Africa Corps hasn't been that impactful either. If that's true, it won't be that surprising. I think that was pretty much the outcome a lot of the foreign policy community have been expecting. Mali's been struggling with rebels for 10, 20 years now. It's been some time. They had originally had a significant French military mission in the country that was helping them with it, but there was a military coup and some nationalist officers seized power. And like a lot of nationalists in Mali, they kind of blame the French for a lot of the country's problems since the French colonized Mali back in the day. And they accused the French, even after independence, of maintaining a neo-colonial relationship with Mali. So the coup and the government that they set up broke ties with France, and they kicked the French mission out and welcomed in a Russian alternative, which at the time was Wagner Group, but eventually Wagner Group was sort of disbanded and reformed into, I think, multiple different groups, actually, is what I read recently. The one in Mali is called Africa Corps, but then there's a couple others as well in some other places. And I think the nationalist junta that seized power was hoping that the Russians might be more aggressive. They thought maybe the issue was that the French were being too soft on the rebels and weren't going hard enough. And obviously, the Russians have a reputation for going pretty hard on rebels. So they thought the Wagner Group mission might be a good alternative. But it hasn't worked out. They've definitely been more violent, but it has not had the effect of mitigating the momentum of the rebellion. And so it's dragged out and just gotten more violent over time.
For a geography refresher, where is Mali?
Mali is in West Africa. It's part of the Sahel region. It's east of Mauritania and west of Chad? No, Niger. It's west of Niger.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, and then Chad, I think. Let me check my work on that. You've got me curious. Mauritania, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a big country geographically speaking, but the vast majority of the population resides in the south of the country. And so the bulk of the geographic territory in Mali is part of the Sahara Desert. So that's the northern 2/3, let's say, of Mali. And the major ethnic group in the Sahara, in the Western Sahara anyway, is the Tuaregs. And they're the majority in northern Mali. but they only make up like 5 to 10% of the population. It's really not much. And like a lot of ethnic minorities, they kind of feel like their interests are not well represented in government. They feel that they don't really have a voice because they're just too small, basically. So the government kind of ignores them, exploits resources in their territory without sharing revenue, takes on an assimilationist bent that endangers the propagation of their culture. You know, prototypical ethnic minority stuff. If you follow politics in different countries, it's almost always present to some degree. Yeah, I think, God, like 15 years ago now, they kind of peaked. They had a big offensive they launched in conjunction with some Islamists. I'm talking about the ethno-nationalist Tuareg rebels. They allied with some Islamists, and they successfully launched an offensive that seized the city of Timbuktu, some other large towns, basically kicked the government out of northern Mali, and they were actually well on their way to marching south towards the capital before the French mission that was in Mali, in conjunction with the Mali army, was able to successfully stem their advance and eventually restore government sovereignty over the north of Mali. But it was definitely looking pretty hairy there for a while. Yeah, that was in the aftermath of the collapse of the Libyan government. There was a lot of speculation that weapons from Gaddafi's government managed to find their way into other countries in the Sahel, contributing to an upsurge of militant activity of one kind or another.
Oh yeah, I looked up Mali. I will show it on stream. So you have a refresher. Ta-da! West Africa. South of Algeria. West of Niger. Mauritania is to its west. Burkina Faso to its south. I see. So the Sahara is basically just in the northern part where those huge open areas are in all those countries. The countries by the coast are probably more like richly concentrated with livable area, whereas the huge countries there have a lot of desert in each of them.
Exactly.
Today I learned about Mali.
Yeah, Mali is kind of a sad case study because it was authoritarian through most of the Cold War to varying degrees. But after the Cold War ended, they actually democratized. And Mali was actually considered one of, if not the leading success stories of African democratization in the post-Cold War period. They were doing pretty well. Their elections were fairly competitive. They had their issues, but they seem to have successfully transitioned to an actual democracy. And they were held up as a case study in what Africa, and more specifically authoritarian African nations, could achieve if they really made efforts to reform. But then over time, you know, they had more and more problems with rebel activity, and it kind of delegitimized the government to the point where it was fairly easy for officers in the army to organize and successfully impose a coup that overthrew the government. So that long track record of successful democratization that lasted 20-some years in Mali, it was broken by that coup. And it's not clear if it's going to be restored. Yeah, unfortunately, West Africa has been a pretty happening place for the past decade. Lots of problems with desertification. That's been kind of pushing a lot of the migrant peoples, the nomadic herdsmen that are in the Sahel further south. And when they do that, they end up conflicting with sort of the sedentary farmers in the southern part of the Sahel. and the northern part of the coastal West African plain. That's resulted in a big uptick in violence, banditry. It's gotten really bad, actually, in the Sahel over the past 10 years for that reason. You don't hear about it much because it's generally not bad enough to threaten actual governments. Like, state sovereignty is not really in question. But the state's sovereignty and control over large stretches of territory in the Sahel actually is in question. And the violence in those areas has definitely spiked considerably over the past decade, correspondingly.
Yeah, you're not a very strong government if you can't enforce the laws in your land.
Yeah. So between the power of the state not being in danger, just sort of threatened in individual provinces and regions, between that fact and the fact that people just don't pay much attention to West Africa or Africa as a whole in general, it generally doesn't make the news much, so you don't hear about it. But it's definitely been one of the hot spots in terms of violent conflict. I think Mali has a significant civil war. I don't even know if you can call it a civil war. It borders on civil war. It's kind of a low intensity conflict. Let's put it like that. Mali has a significant low intensity conflict. Burkina Faso does. Chad and Niger do. Nigeria does in individual provinces. Central African Republic actually has a full-on civil war, but it's kind of waxed and waned with time. So it's kind of hard to delineate which years it's really full tilt and which years it's not, because it just kind of changes so often. I think there was a coup in Guinea as well. But the new government that came out of that hasn't been nearly as dysfunctional as the other states. And Guinea didn't have a big insurrection of some kind in progress when the coup happened. You know, the coup kind of stemmed from other factors. So things have actually been relatively stable there. There was also a coup in Guinea-Bissau, but that kind of predates the rise of the violence in the Sahel. That was kind of its own standalone event. And that actually saw the overthrow of the dictator, not the imposition of one. Liberia and Sierra Leone just kind of continue to exist. There's not much happening there. Yeah, the civil wars there ended in, the early aughts, I want to say. And they've actually been pretty quiet since then. There's been a little bit of action in Togo. I think they had a demagogue, basically, win the presidency there. He had a really cool name. I think it was President Talon, if I'm not mistaken.
Talon, that's a cool name.
Yeah, let me fact check that. No. No. Benin, okay, not Togo. Patrice Guillaume Athanas Talon, President of Benin. Ghana's doing well. But Ghana always kind of does well.
Why does Ghana always do well?
Sorry, what?
Why does Ghana always do well?
They've been the most stable, successful country in West Africa since decolonization started in Africa in the mid-20th century. Partly it's because they exported a lot of gold, so that kind of gave the government a pretty strong revenue source. But, you know, as we know from the resource curse, having a strong source of revenue based off of resources is not like a guarantee of stability. So gold exports combined with a political elite that was relatively well behaved by the standards of West Africa meant that political institutions were able to evolve in Ghana that were relatively less corrupt and more efficient than other countries in the region. And so that facilitated economic stability, the emergence of a middle class, very, very little political violence. Yeah, it's just kind of West Africa's star performer, basically. They even have their own little space program.
Nice.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll send anyone once we put a moon base on the moon?
Maybe.
They could chill with us.
Yeah, they won't have like their own rocket, if that's what you mean. They'll have to kind of ride shotgun on somebody else's. Their space program is mostly like developing satellites, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much astronauts and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But hypothetically, I'm sure they probably could produce an astronaut, maybe train somebody up in conjunction with NASA or something. Yeah, they did have an unstable period. I think it was in the 80s when they had a military coup, overthrow the government, seize control. And I think the subsequent military junta governed Ghana for like 10 years, something like that. But they got pretty lucky. The guy that took charge was actually pretty competent, and he was actually invested in the well-being of the country and not just enriching himself. So as a result, even though he overthrew the government, he actually still has a pretty positive reputation. I don't remember his name. Rawlings. Jerry Rawlings. 1981 to, I don't know. No, 1981 to 2001. I guess it was 20 years then. Yeah, as I understand it, he's pretty well regarded in Ghana. So yeah, they've had pretty good fortune as far as political elites. They've tried to kind of keep things stable. They've respected democratic institutions for the most part, and the ones that have not have actually built institutions instead of co-opting them.
Mm-hmm.
So Ghana has a lot to show for it correspondingly. It's not to say they don't have their problems, but, you know, compared to the rest of the region, yeah, they're doing very well.
What is their, like, cultural makeup? Are they Christian, Muslim, what?
It's kind of mixed. I think it's majority Christian. The way it works in West Africa is that the coastal region in the south of West Africa is majority Christian, and then the further inland you go, the more Muslim it gets. So countries in the Sahel tend to be heavily Muslim. So like Mali, for example. But then coastal countries like Ghana tend to be more evenly balanced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd have to look up the specific data point. I want to say it's majority Christian with a large Muslim minority. Let me check here. Religion, Christian 71%, Muslim 19.9%. So yeah, how about a fifth Muslim, and then pretty much the rest is Christian.
I see.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same all along the coast of West Africa. I think there's a couple that don't have a lot of inland territory, like Liberia and Sierra Leone, that are heavily Christian. Let me check that. But most of them tend to have some inland territory, so they generally have large Muslim minorities. Yeah, Liberia is like 85% Christian. I don't know if you've heard of Nigeria's civil war back in the 70s. I guess maybe it started in the late 60s. I think it started in like 69, 1970, something in that range. It basically saw the southernmost provinces of Nigeria, specifically in the southeast, try to break away from the country and become independent. And that was basically an ethnic conflict because the provinces in the southeast trying to break away were majority Igbo, if I remember correctly. And basically the Igbo were heavily Christian. Like vast majority of the population there was Christian. I think the Yoruba in the southwest are also heavily Christian. And then in the north of Nigeria, it's mostly ethnic Hausa, and they're heavily Muslim.
Today I learned. We did have a few more questions, and
All right.
Sea of Whiskey is agreeing to help us out.
Oh, thank you, Sea of Whiskey. Always appreciate the mods helping out.
Indeed.
Let's see. I am keen to understand the perspective of Hungary in relation to new power structure, energy dependency on Russia, and impact on Eastern Europe vis-a-vis EU relationship. Well, I mean, the perspective of Hungary kind of implies a monolithic perspective, and that's not really quite an accurate portrayal. You know, Hungary, like any country, has diverse political factions, you know. Certainly right now, the relatively Europhile nationalists are ascendant. You know, they got the supermajority in the last election, but, you know, there's still plenty of Eurosceptic nationalists running around the country. And you could say that there's not really a lot of daylight between them in any case. You know, both of them are very conservative and nationalist in terms of politics. They just kind of differ on relatively minor things. So the perspective of Hungary kind of depends on who you're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my understanding is that the urbanites in the big cities, especially Budapest, tend to be relatively left-wing and Europhile in outlook. You know, that itself is a broad generalization because, you know, there's always generally a large minority of conservatives in big cities. But in general, they tend to be more Europhile there in the big cities, more educated, you know, kind of like they are in any developed country, not a big shit, not a lot of difference in that sense. And then by extension, basically the more rural it gets, generally the more conservative it gets, and the more Eurosceptic. Yeah, I think we've talked about it before, but the new government is not going to be all that much different than the previous government. Like the main difference probably will be foreign policy and corruption. Because the previous government generally didn't give too much of a shit about corruption. You know, their attitude is that conflict of interest was not really their problem. They didn't really worry about that too much. So the new government is promising to try to crack down on that. And then, of course, the previous government under Orban was known for being fairly a Russophile. You know, they didn't like the European Union kind of butting into Hungary's business, and they wanted relatively good ties with Russia. Why they wanted good relations with Russia kind of depends on who you ask. The Hungarian government under Orban argued that they wanted to do it for one, security reasons. You know, they didn't want to end up in some kind of conflict between Russia and the broader West. They wanted to kind of maintain a degree of neutrality. And they also wanted to cultivate energy security. They wanted to try to make sure that they maintained a supply of cheap Russian natural gas. The Orban government saw that as very much in the country's interest. So the new government is going to basically do the opposite of that. They want closer ties with the European Union. They want to distance Hungary from Russia. They don't see Russian natural gas or oil as being so valuable as to warrant the maintenance of some kind of special relationship with them. So presumably they will shift gears and find alternatives to Russian natural gas and oil like the rest of Europe has, and try to lean into cooperation with other countries in the European Union. Now, I would point out that the new incoming government, while it will be relatively Europhile compared to the Orban government, they're still relatively Eurosceptic. They're actually very nationalist in terms of outlook. So the change is just going to be relative. I keep saying that word because I want to emphasize it. It will be a relative shift towards a Europhile foreign policy. But in the grand scheme of things, it's still going to be a nationalist government that wants to prioritize Hungarian sovereignty. They're not really looking to make compromises on that count. So if I ever don't get the gist of a question, feel free to ask again, and I'm happy to return to it. But in general, that is the Hungarian perspective of the incoming government and their supporters. But there is still going to be a large minority of people that kind of retain the perspective of the outgoing government. That's not going to change anytime soon. And it could be that the new government suffers the fate of a lot of Europhile centrist governments that have come into power over the past couple decades, which is that they can't really fundamentally solve the underlying issues in the country's politics in a way that's satisfactory for most voters, to the point where they end up getting voted out in some later election that sees populists return to power. Yeah, there's a lot of structural problems in European countries and economies that pretty much no political party of any kind is well disposed to be able to solve. So it's entirely possible that the new government in Hungary will suffer on that count, as many others have. Let's see, something that hasn't been talked about a lot, but I would like to hear my opinion on. What do I think about Canada's position, specifically considering Canada's geographical position in relation to the US, considering the history between the US and Canada? How do things look in the future when it comes to the US having the current administration? It's kind of hard to judge right now because the Trump administration is such a bizarre and substantive departure from previous administrations in the United States. So it's hard to tell if the Trump administration kind of augurs a new normal, where this sort of America First nationalism becomes a fixture in American foreign policy, or if this is more of a kind of one-off. If this is something that's just going to kind of fade with time, and after Trump leaves office, we see a kind of regression to the mean, where pre-Trump status quo kind of reasserts itself to varying degrees, depending on the party and the president. So if it's the former case, then yeah, there's definitely going to be a lot more impetus for Canada, among other countries, to try to hedge the influence of the United States and the US government in particular. But if it's the latter, then the impetus is much weaker. If it's the latter, then this is more just a kind of a storm they have to weather before they get back to the status quo. There would still be an impetus in that case to try to mitigate potential future vulnerabilities, but I think given just how entwined the US and Canada are economically, I think the impetus for hedging has to be pretty strong for any Canadian government to really seriously pursue it. Because just realistically speaking, it's going to be very difficult for Canada to hedge American economic influence, like to the point where it's almost not even practical. Like the United States, pretty much by default, is going to be Canada's largest trade partner. So while the Canadian government can take steps to hedge that dependency and influence, there's a hard cap on how far they can take that. I think if they really wanted to take it to its logical conclusion, they would almost have to just leave, not NAFTA, CUSMA, basically the agreement that replaced NAFTA. They would have to leave that. They would probably slowly but consistently raise tariffs in order to mitigate trade with the United States, and then try to negotiate trade agreements that saw significant decreases in the trade barriers faced by Canadian producers. That's probably like the maximal position that they could follow, the maximal policy as far as mitigating American economic influence. And even if they did that, even if they went to that extreme, the US would still be their largest trade partner. The US influence economically would still be immense, even if they did all of that. And it would come with significant economic disruptions for Canada. Like, realistically, there's not any combination of trade partners Canada could coalesce and reach trade agreements with that would be able to replace all of the trade Canada has with the United States. It's just not going to happen, realistically speaking. So Canada's position strategically, as far as the potential threat posed by an aggressive American administration, is category fucked. There's not a lot they can do there. If the United States really wants to fuck with them, there's just not a whole lot that they're going to be able to do other than to suffer the consequences.
I feel like there's super tight cultural overlap between U.S. culture and Canadian culture as well. So, no U.S. citizen would ever want us to take a hostile stance toward Canada. I can't even think of something that Canada did bad to us, aside from Nickelback.
Yeah, you'd have to go back almost 2 centuries to find real tension there. It's been a very peaceful, positive-sum relationship for like 200 years, to everybody's benefit. The U.S.-Canadian border is one of the longest borders on the planet, so it behooves both parties to keep relations on good terms. And there's really no benefit to doing otherwise. Trump administration is not doing the United States any favors by antagonizing Canada. They've been good neighbors. We get everything we could possibly need or want from them, and relatively cheaply. So, like, what's the point? We really don't get much out of it. So I don't see the Trump administration's logic there other than posturing. Supposedly they want to do it for reshoring. I get the logic there, but like, why? The benefit to the United States from reshoring manufacturing from Canada is just so marginal. It makes much more sense to just allow the free trade to happen there and allow Canada to specialize in certain things so that American companies can benefit. Trade like that is itself positive sum. Like, everybody benefits. It comes with costs, but the benefits outweigh them. Like, there's no reason not to do it, especially when you have a partner like Canada that is willing to play ball and make compromises. So, like, it's not anything anybody should be seeking to disrupt. Like, everybody wins with the relationship as it was before the Trumpian disruptions. And I suspect a lot of economic actors in both the US and Canada are expecting the relationship to return to normal at some point. They'll talk about uncertainty, as far as how long the Trumpian disruptions will last, as a reason why they haven't been more proactive in reshoring as is. Because, if a new administration comes in and says, okay, well, all of the Trump executive orders that change the Trump trade relationship with Canada, we're just going to write those out with new executive orders. That'll be a wash. And so then everything kind of goes back to normal overnight in that case. And Biden basically did something like that early on in his presidency, where he just wrote a whole shit ton of executive orders, undoing Trump's executive orders. So there's no reason that can't happen again. And if you're a company that has significant investments in Canada and prefers to maintain those investments, like, you have every incentive to just stick out the Trumpian period and wait it out, and then eventually benefit when tariffs and the overarching trade architecture returns to some degree of normalcy. So corporations, not a bad weather vane to use. probably they're betting correctly. Probably the Trumpian era of trade relationships and trade policy will prove to be pretty ephemeral. We really don't have much to show for it. And, we're in year 6 now of Trump governance, right? Between his first term and his current term. And just what realistically has the United States gained from his trade policy? I don't feel like there's much to show for it. There would have to be a much longer term commitment with much more public support for his approach to it in order to result in significant changes in the behavior of corporations and other economic actors, and that does not exist. And even if he did succeed on his own terms, that's negative sum. The overarching economy in the United States would be objectively worse for it. Just less global specialization results in more inefficiency and a less robust economy. That was the whole reason the United States signed into NAFTA and the World Trade Organization and whatnot in the first place. A lot of major manufacturers were dragging ass. They weren't generating growth. And so free trade agreements were signed, and they were able to generate that growth through specialization, diversification, manufacturing, opening up new markets. All of it worked out. It just negatively impacted a multitude of manufacturing-dependent communities in the United States. That was a real cost, but it was offset to gains to the broader economy and society, not only in the US, but everywhere, globally. There was a massive global economic boom at that time. Hundreds of millions of people were pulled out of poverty, and it provided opportunities in the United States too. Free trade can work. It's just politically fraught. The benefits are spread around evenly everywhere, but the penalties, the losers, are heavily concentrated in very specific jurisdictions. And in the US political system, where it's first past the post districts that determine who gets elected, that represented a disproportionate advantage to the opponents of free trade that eventually culminated in a trade skeptic administration and Congress, relatively speaking. The death of free trade has been grossly exaggerated. It's actually still mostly there, mostly intact. Certainly the Trump administration and like-minded administrations in different countries antagonistic to trade have done some damage, but overall it's actually kind of doing okay. And it would be entirely possible to return to a pre-Trump status quo on that count as well. That's kind of what happened with Biden, and probably something similar will happen with whoever replaces Trump. And it may be that even a Republican administration that takes power after Trump is gone kind of course corrects on that count and ends up having a fairly pro-free trade outlook in terms of trade policy. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. What was the question?
Is it the one?
It was about Canada.
Yeah,
sorry?
Canada. Canadian relations, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, so, if you're Canada, sure, hedge your bets, but probably, Vegas odds, things kind of go back to normal for the most part in 2 years and change. Keep in mind that very little of what Trump has done in trade policy has actually been codified into law. Congress has not actually passed any laws that are going to cement what he's done. And he's kind of running out of time, because if Democrats do take control of the House of Representatives, then it's pretty much off the table entirely. I think I've noted before how strange it is that so little of Trump's policy preferences have actually been enacted into law, despite the fact that the GOP controls, de facto all three branches of government at this point. So there hasn't been much to show for it. So if he hasn't done anything by the end of the year, pretty much, he may not get another opportunity, and he'll be effectively a lame duck president. Let's see. Will the redistricting of Virginia go through, or will it get overturned by the Supreme Court? Someone told me that the referendum was made to reverse court redistricting as a whole. Republicans voted down, consequently undoing Texas, California, etc. That's kind of a developing story, because I've read that a court threw it out and said that they could not go through with the gerrymandered districts. But I think I read a day or two that a new court that they appealed to would allow it to go through. Something to that effect. So I don't know what the final status of that is going to be. That seems to be tied up in the courts for the moment. So yeah, I can't comment on it too much more than that. This is just part of the overarching gerrymandering tit for tat that's been happening in the United States for the past couple of years. Texas announced that it was going to gerrymander so that the Republican Party could pick up some seats in the House. California retaliated by announcing that they would do the same for Democrats. And so it's just kind of been going back and forth between different states. Indiana's Republicans actually just said flat out that they were not going to participate, which is to their credit. You know, they already have their own laws on bipartisan, I think, districting, or bipartisan design of districts and their boundaries. And I didn't, despite the fact that Trump and other partisans in the state were pressuring them to kind of abandon that, the GOP leadership in the state decided to stick with it. I think there's been a couple states that have kind of approached it like that. Virginia, not among them. Virginia Democrats jumped onto the gerrymander train, but they've kind of been hobbled by opposition by the GOP. So we'll see if they actually kind of push it through or not. It's all pretty stupid, but you know, that's kind of the theme of the era. Mm-hmm. So we'll see how it all shakes out. Would you mind talking about anything you know about Timbuktu's involvement as a Casablanca-like town during World War II? I don't think Timbuktu played a big role in the war. Like with Casablanca, you can point to the conference that the Big Three had. It was obviously invaded at one point in the Operation Torch, the invasion of West Africa in 42. Yeah, beyond that, though, I don't think there's anything comparable to that stuff for Timbuktu. At least nothing's coming to mind. I think I do remember reading about some raiding by Free French forces. I don't know if you remember the Free French, Neuro, but they were basically the what's the best way to describe them? They're not rebel. They were not rebels per se. They were basically Frenchmen who wanted to keep fighting the Germans, even though the French government had surrendered.
Charles de Gaulle is one of them?
Yeah, he was actually their leader. So they did not recognize the French government's surrender, and so they fled the country so that they could keep fighting with the Allies. And they created their own little command structure and basically ended up forming a government in exile that was separate and distinct from that of the Vichy French government that ruled France after the French collapsed in 41. Wait, no, it wasn't 40. It was 1940. It wasn't. Yeah, it would have been 1940. So they started out pretty small and then scaled up over time. They did have some supporters in, I think, Central Africa. There was a couple of French colonies in Central Africa that declared loyalty to the Free French authorities instead of the Vichy French authorities. And so the result is that the Free French launched some raids from Central Africa into West Africa, and I think also into North Africa to a lesser degree. And there were some Free French raiders that fought with the British in the battle for North Africa, the campaign between Montgomery and Rommel back in the day. But I don't think that ever encompassed Timbuktu. I think that was well to the east of Mali. Yeah, the only other thing I can think of involving West Africa, beyond just Timbuktu, but even just West Africa, is that the Allies ended up using it as a kind of waypoint. So aircraft traveling from, let's say, the United States to British bases in Egypt, or later on in northern Africa after they pushed the Germans and Italians out, they would use West Africa as a waypoint for aircraft. Basically, they would travel from the United States, I think, to Brazil, and then to West Africa, and then on to where they wanted to go, wherever that was. I don't think it was like logistically important beyond that. I don't think they produced like an important natural resource or represented like a key battlefield or anything like that. At least nothing is coming to mind anyway.
The story of the Free French is badass. I like the concept of your country's invaded, you're in big trouble, your government negotiates a surrender and the terms and this, and you're like, no, fuck your surrender. We're going over here now. We're going to still fight you. Okay, well.
Yeah, they stuck it out. Yeah, it took them a while to matter, though. You know, they didn't have a lot of volunteers in the first couple years, so that kind of hobbled them. They picked up more, I think, in like 43, 44, especially when they actually landed in Africa, or not Africa. In 44, when they actually landed in France, and it became apparent the Vichy French government was going to collapse. They saw a big surge in volunteers after that. Yeah, French politics was messy before and during World War II. You know, people like to remember the Free French and the French resistance and whatnot. But in practice, you know, there were a combination of collaborators and then also people who were not really collaborators, but just didn't think the Allies had a chance. Yeah, that third group was especially common in 1940 and 41. You know, there was a lot of Frenchmen who had the sense that the British would not be able to survive without them. And so once the French army collapsed in 1940, a lot of people just kind of thought it was a matter of time before the Germans either successfully conquered the UK or forced them into some kind of peace agreement. So in light of that assumption, there was not really thought to be any real avenue to victory. So a lot of people just kind of checked out. Yeah, the British raid on the naval base in North Africa didn't help. I can't remember. It was like Mars El Greb. I don't think I ever did learn how to pronounce it correctly. Basically, there was a big French naval base in West Africa, in North Africa, rather. And after the French surrendered, the Royal Navy, at the behest of the British government, asked the admiral in charge of the French Navy, I think his name was Admiral Darlan, they asked him to surrender the French Navy at this North African port I'm thinking of. And he didn't want to do it. And the British didn't want the ships to fall into the hands of the Germans, and so after Darlan refused to surrender, they actually attacked the port and sank the ships. And unfortunately, they ended up killing a number of French sailors as a result, and that turned into a big scandal in France. So, you know, for a lot of French nationalists that were skeptical about British prospects after the defeat of France, that seemed like a good reason to turn on the British. It definitely soured a lot of people who maybe were on the fence on continuing the fight. Yeah. Yeah, I think for the first year, they kind of just tried to organize in Africa and the colonies that refused to recognize the Vichy French. I think there were I think there were a lot of French colonies in the Pacific that actually declared for the Free French. That was kind of out of the way. They didn't have a lot to offer in terms of manpower or resources, so it didn't end up mattering too much. Caribbean French territories, I think, mostly remained loyal to the Vichy French. But I think they ended up coming to some kind of special accommodation with the US government. Obviously, Washington didn't want Germans setting up in overseas French territories in the Western Hemisphere, so there was a kind of arrangement where the Germans were not allowed, but otherwise they would be able, that is to say, these territories would be able to remain part of France. One of the funny stories of the Free French in that period, sort of the early years, is that they unilaterally, without notifying either the British or American governments, organized an invasion of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. And if you've never heard of those are two French island territories off the coast of Nova Scotia. They're, I think, one of the only remaining vestiges of the French Empire in North America outside of the Caribbean. They actually still control them to this day. But after the fall of France, early in World War II, the two islands actually declared loyalty, declared for the Vichy government and not the Free French. And so the Free French, for reasons known only to de Gaulle, decided to just take them back. And the first time Roosevelt and Churchill heard about it was after it happened. They had no idea, and they were not very happy about it.
That's funny.
Yeah, that was at least a successful effort. I think there was another effort at a Free French invasion, I think this time of French West Africa. I don't remember where it was, but they landed somewhere and tried to take it by force and failed miserably. Turned into a big clusterfuck. I think the only other big adventure I remember them going on before Normandy was Madagascar. I think they participated in the British invasion of Madagascar. I think that was like 41 or 42. So they helped them out with that since Madagascar had been a French territory. Yeah, they were concerned about the Japanese potentially setting up in Madagascar, since the Vichy were kind of aligned with the Germans, and so the Germans could have forced them to allow Japanese submarines to operate out of Madagascar, which obviously would have been a problem for the Allies because one of the major Lend-Lease routes ran through the Indian Ocean. So they wanted to forestall that by invading.
Were there any other naval battles in the Indian Ocean in World War II?
Yes. Not very many, though. Madagascar wasn't a naval battle, but it kind of related to naval concerns. But there was a Japanese task force. I think this would have been a month or so after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Just a reminder, when the Japanese basically started their involvement in World War II, in so much as you want to consider the Pacific War the start of their involvement, that's a whole can of worms unto itself. But they didn't just bomb Pearl Harbor, they actually bombed a whole shit ton of places. They bombed Singapore, they bombed the Philippines, which was then an American territory. They invaded Malaysia, and I think they also invaded Hong Kong. And I think they also attacked Guam and some other American territories in the Pacific. So it was a region-wide offensive. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor. And after about a month after they started that offensive, they redirected the bulk of their naval assets, including most of those that had participated in Pearl Harbor, into the Indian Ocean. And when they were in the Indian Ocean, this task force launched a series of raids. At one point, they bombed Calcutta, raided the east coast of India a couple times, and they also attacked a major naval base in the Maldives, I think it was. I think at one point they had turned... Huh?
Maldives?
Maldives, yeah. It's kind of an archipelago south of India. It's an independent country now, but it had been British at one point. Yeah, the British had built up a naval base there. I don't think it was meant to be like their main naval base, but basically just meant to give them some degree of, redundancy. And obviously, once the Japanese had invaded Burma and sent the task force into the Indian Ocean, they were concerned about naval assets coming under attack in the east of India. So they relocated a lot of their assets south towards Maldives. So the Japanese knew that and they raided it, but they didn't end up doing much damage. They didn't end up doing much damage because the Royal Navy had reallocated those assets again, even further south into the Chagos Archipelago. So the Japanese had not known about that, and as a result, they were not able to do significant damage to the Royal Navy during their raiding. And I think they did that for a couple weeks before they ended up withdrawing the task force for redeployment into the South Pacific. I think that was the bulk of the naval fighting in the Indian Ocean during World War II. Obviously, there would have been some submarine activity. I think Japanese submarines continued to kind of prowl around and attack shipping as best they could. But I don't think they were ever all that successful. And that's about it, as far as I remember anyway.
I see.
Yeah, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. And we do enjoy the feedback we get on here.
Chat's mentioning Douglas MacArthur in World War II messing up the defense of the Philippines.
He was kind of an ass.
Mm-hmm.
Big ego. Kind of thought he was the shit. It's no surprise he ended up getting kicked out.
He still got his name on a decent bit of stuff in Texas.
I'm not surprised. Texans would like a guy with big ego. Well, I think other than that, the Free French, other than all of that I mentioned and participating in the North Africa campaign, I think they also participated in the campaign in Italy in a limited capacity. And then they participated in the invasion of France, obviously. And the anecdote I have about the Free French during the liberation of France is that Charles de Gaulle was hell-bent on liberating Paris. More specifically, he was hell-bent on French troops liberating Paris. And for the most part, the other allies were willing to indulge in that. They did kind of halt just ahead of Paris so that the Free French could be the ones to actually do it.
Nice.
But there was a little bit of controversy there, because the troops that did most of the fighting for the Free French in that period, in the lead up to the attack on Paris, were actually Algerian. The Free French used a lot of colonial French troops, so Algerians, Indo-Chinese, West Africans, what have you. I think the Algerians were the main ones, though. And French leadership did not really like the idea of colonial troops being the ones to liberate Paris. So on the verge of pushing into Paris, they actually cycled in some white European French troops and had them move into Paris. So there's some consternation on the part of French nationalists today on that account.
I see.
At the time, it was not that controversial, but in decades since, sensibilities have changed. There's a little bit of white guilt there, you could say. And actually, that's a good excuse to talk about a movie that is explicitly about Algerian colonial troops fighting for France in World War II. Let me see if I can remember the name. It was something like Les Indigènes. It was actually pretty famous when it came out for making this whole issue well known to the French public. Oh, boy.
Yeah, if someone's willing to fight and die for you, it's good to, at a very minimum, remember them for doing so.
Yeah, it came out like back in the aughts.
At the absolute bare minimum, could you please at least acknowledge our sacrifice? Thank you.
Yeah, the French name is Indigènes, or Indigène. I'm not going to pronounce it right. The English name is Days of Glory. There you go. It was made in 2006. It's pretty good. I actually remember watching it way back in the day.
Cool.
Yeah, there's a whole discussion we could have about French Algeria. That's a whole discussion unto itself. There's a lot of history there. But as far as the Free French in World War II, that's a good reference point if you want to watch a movie about it.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
If you want a little more trivia, Roosevelt and Churchill wanted to install a hand-picked leader to be the new leader of France after the liberation. They actually did not want it to be de Gaulle. They were not on great terms with de Gaulle. So while they appreciated his achievements as leader of the Free French, they did not really feel like he would be sufficiently pliant to be a good leader of France after liberation. And so they had some other guy, I don't remember who it was that they picked, but it ended up falling through because de Gaulle basically willed himself into the leadership of the new French government. He set up his own government, and everybody accepted it because, you know, he was sort of the face of the resistance, the face of Free France. And so the attempts by the Allies to set up a different government that they recognized ended up faltering. And so through sheer personality and force of will, de Gaulle kind of just sabotaged that whole effort. A little bit of foreshadowing. That that kind of typified the relationship between de Gaulle and the Anglo-American alliance for several decades after that. He never really trusted them, and he was always kind of on maybe not bad terms, but relations were always kind of tense.
Mm-hmm.
He really didn't feel like the Anglo-American compact was really fully incorporating himself and the French government into their decision making. So all of that comes out of a question about Timbuktu in World War II that I can't answer. As far as I know, Timbuktu didn't play a big role, but I'm open to correction.
Tangents are one of the things we do best here in World Discussion.
Let's see. What is a little-known fact about Peter Thiel's influence on American politics? I mean, I would argue that a little-known fact about Peter Thiel's influence is that it's way oversold. I've not really been convinced by the argumentation that he's kind of a secret power broker, you know, some kind of big mover in American politics. I recognize that he's trying. He's definitely spending money to that effect, cultivating relationships, etc. But from what I've read and seen of him, I don't think he has a lot to show for it. I don't expect him to get a lot of traction. I think even just going beyond Peter Thiel and looking at the political influence of billionaires writ large, all of the money that they've been spending has not really had that much of an effect. I think people pay kind of too much attention to billionaires as a source of corruption in American politics. That's not to say they're not influential, but you know, the real influence is just industry writ large, not individual billionaires. You know, American economic actors, especially the largest of them, have always been major political actors in the United States. You know, the recent cohort of billionaires that people like to harp on, they're kind of the newest iteration of that, but they're not a complete picture. You know, just industry in the United States is inherently influential. Whether that industry is controlled by a single dude or is controlled by investors or private equity or even just public investors, like the outcome is going to be the same. There are always going to be big political movers and shakers, you know, to varying degrees. So Peter Thiel is kind of in that camp. Yes, he's influential, but he's not like the guy making the big decisions. And really, you could extrapolate that to industry. Even though it's very influential, they don't always get their way. I think ever since Citizens United, people have really been fixated on money in American politics. But in the studies that I've seen, the actual return on investment like the actual tangible impact of all that extra money sloshing around in American politics has actually been pretty marginal. They have not really gotten a lot of return for all of that money they've been spending. You know, election outcomes don't really seem to change that much on account of it, in other words. I know people like to harp on things like universal health care and other reforms like that that corporations don't want, but like resistance to that goes beyond just the private sector. You know, there's a large cohort of voters in the United States that are dead set opposed to it, and that opposition is not rooted in like corporate brainwashing or propaganda. It's mostly just rooted in ideological preferences. There's a lot of people that just don't want statist solutions to healthcare, and that's pretty consistent with a thread of American political thought that goes back to the founding of the country. That's not new. So I'm sure corporate influence and money accentuates that, but even without that, you would probably still not have national health care in the United States, just because there's a strong cohort of voters whom have preferences that are antithetical to it. So yes, get the money out of American politics, but it's not as influential as people think it is. A lot more of political outcomes in the United States can be attributed to political preferences by American voters than by lobbying by big corporations or American business, or certainly billionaires like Peter Thiel. Let's see, is the wave of populism because of power and socioeconomic disparities between 99% and 1%? Not really. Inequality is also kind of oversold as a major political driver. You know, certainly people have always gotten upset about it, and it's definitely a driver for a large cohort of voters, but it's quite possible to have a lot of inequality and to have a stable political system, or even more broadly speaking, like a stable society. It's not as destabilizing as people like to make it out to be. A bigger issue is just structural economic changes that have been wrought over the past 50-some years, pretty much in all countries, but especially in developed countries. Just a kind of de-emphasis on manufacturing as the beating heart of the economy. You know, the shift away from that has been especially disorienting for a lot of working class people in the developed world. You know, it used to be there was a kind of economic social contract where you would go to work for a big company, generally at, you know, some labor intensive type job working for the company. And if you worked hard for them and didn't explicitly fuck up, they would kind of take care of you over the course of your career. And then at the end of it, you'd retire, you'd get a pension, and you would just kind of do your thing. So, you know, that was kind of the way it worked. And that provided a sufficiently stable livelihood for enough people in the developed world that a period of stability and prosperity resulted out of that. But as that model has faltered for a variety of reasons, political instability has resulted correspondingly. People do not react well to uncertainty. You know, people actually react better in terms of political stability to an outcome and status quo that is objectively bad to them, but predictably bad, rather than a circumstance where things are actually kind of okay to good, but unpredictably so. That's kind of where we are in much of the developed world. It's actually kind of pretty good overall, but there's way less certainty now than there was even just a couple decades ago. And people don't like that. You know, some people can thrive in that environment. Some people are okay with kind of not knowing where they're going to be in like 5 to 10 years. There's a lot of people that are sufficiently adaptable to live like that and to be happy and content. Unfortunately, probably most of the population, or at least broad swaths of the population in any given country, are not like that. They much, much prefer stability and are willing to trade off quite a bit in order to get it, both in terms of politics, but also in terms of economics, just the terms of where their next meal is going to come from, having basic essentials, etc. They want that to be locked in. And sort of the current model, broadly speaking, the neoliberal model that has been dominant for, 30, probably longer than that, 40, 50 years now, it doesn't really offer that anymore. At least it doesn't offer that to enough of the population for there to be political stability. And like I mentioned, the reasons for that structural change are, there are multiple reasons for that. Some of it is just international competition. After World War II, the United States had a kind of golden age for like 10, 20 years, where the United States had very high standard of living for its blue collar workers and job security, and decent return on investment. Like capital and labor were pretty happy in the US in that period. But it was always going to be temporary, because a lot of that was just predicated on Europe and Japan getting absolutely fucking eviscerated in World War II. And as the manufacturing bases in those places recovered, there was more competition, and suddenly capital and labor in the United States had to start making trade-offs again. And a lot of people interpreted that return to competition and trade-offs as a representation of a decline in the standard of living, when really it was just kind of regression to mean. So international competition, partly you could say, God, what are some of the other ones? Some of it had to do with changes within, I'm going to talk mostly about the United States here, changes within the United States as far as the distribution of the manufacturing base within the United States, the construction of the international freeway system, I guess technically highway system, in the 1950s made transportation much cheaper over longer distances. And the result of that was some early outsourcing. So people complained about deindustrialization in the 1970s, about jobs either disappearing in the manufacturing sector, mostly in the Midwest, or relocating overseas, more so in the 80s and 90s. But actually, a lot of the jobs that were lost, quote unquote, never left the country. A lot of them just moved to different states. Like a good chunk of the jobs that were lost in manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, etc., actually were lost, quote unquote, to places like Kentucky and Tennessee. But if you're a manufacturing dependent community in the Midwest, it doesn't really matter where you lose them to. It just matters that they're gone and that the economic core of your community has been gutted. So that's part of the reason for deindustrialization and the corresponding delegitimization of the political establishment in the American Midwest specifically. So some of that is just movement within the United States. Actually, some of it wasn't even between states. From what I read, some of it just went to suburbs. Some of it just moved out of the inner city and moved out to suburbs. And even that was pretty, dislocating for a lot of people, and certainly contributed to a lot of, rot in the core urban areas, like Detroit, for example. I would point out again, as I have before, Detroit, the city, has suffered pretty grievously over the past half century, although it's kind of started to recover in the past 10 to 20 years. However, if you look at Detroit, the metropolitan area, if you look at Detroit, the city, plus its suburbs, it hasn't done nearly as badly. It's actually done pretty decently. And the suburbs, if you look at them in isolate, have done very well over the past half century. So what we've seen is not so much like a deadweight loss of manufacturing and overall economic activity. It's more of a reallocation. And yeah, a lot of that did leave the country after 1999 on account of China joining the World Trade Organization. The China shock was a real thing. But deindustrialization was already kind of happening in the United States well before that. And that sort of tension is more the core of populism in the United States. Europe has a very similar parallel evolution of its populism. That kind of comes out more, in their case, though, it comes less out of uncertainty, stemming from, the fracturing of the traditional contract between the blue-collar class and the neoliberal establishment. In Europe's case, it has more to do with stagnation. They still kind of have that old contract in place where if you can get a job, companies will take care of you. The issue, though, is that those companies have not been growing fast enough to create jobs for new workers entering the workforce, to the point where huge swaths of the youth in Europe, especially blue-collar youth, do not have regular work. They basically have to work as either gig workers or work in the gray economy. And those people are kind of locked out of that old contract that the blue-collar working class had had with the establishment.
What is the
And
gray
kind of,
economy?
another word for it is the informal economy. It's not explicitly illegal. Like the black market would be like drugs, illegal weapons, that kind of thing. The gray market is stuff that is not explicitly illegal, but is not necessarily fully legal either.
So
It's kind of
sus.
yeah, it's kind of in between. It's kind of like under the table stuff. Maybe I'll pay you to do a job, but instead of like officially notifying the government that you're on my payroll, I just pay you as a contractor and I pay you in cash so that nobody really knows about it or has to pay taxes on it. And maybe the work you're doing is supposed to be union labor, but I don't want to deal with unions, so I'll just kind of pay you to do it on the down low.
I see.
That's just one example. There's others as well. The gray economy is pretty extensive in a lot of developing countries. In fact, in India, the gray economy basically is the economy. I think something like a majority of India's economy is actually the informal economy. In Europe, it's not that bad, but the gig economy is kind of large there. And that's a response to the economic stagnation of Europe, the inability of European corporations and other major economic actors to kind of move forward and generate the kind of dynamism that they would need in order to really maintain the social order as it has been for the past half century. I think I mentioned earlier that there were structural issues in Europe that meant that parties like the centrist party that won control of Hungary recently would probably end up being delegitimized because they would be unable to address them. This is basically what I was talking about. Structural economic changes in Europe are such that the traditional cornerstones of the European economy are weakening and are unable to provide the kind of tax revenue and job security that had been the cornerstone of the overarching European social contract, the large social spending of one kind or another and whatnot. And so something's got to give, right? Either the companies have to become more competitive somehow, probably through some kind of free market reforms, or alternatively, there has to be significant cuts to the social spending in Europe, and in turn, the undermining of that established social contract. Neither one of those are politically popular pretty much anywhere in Europe. And so the result is that European polities and establishment parties have been stuck, right? They're stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's not really any way they can implement the kind of changes that are needed in order to stabilize the socioeconomic situation that is politically feasible.
You were saying the same thing about the UK as another example of the two ways to save money and improve your economy would be to cut spending, which the healthcare services in the UK as well, like they're also in Europe, are high, and people like the benefits, so they don't want to sacrifice the benefits of that. And then the other option was to deregulate, so a lot of the protections and precautions and things that help workers have better conditions, those are expensive too. So that would be another thing to cut, and people don't want that either. You're like, unless people want to work dangerous job conditions, then this is not going to work, and people don't want to make their healthcare worse than it is. So,
yeah, and no establishment party has been able to square that circle. Like center left, center right hasn't mattered. None of them have been able to figure out how to solve this puzzle. And the result is that it's created room in European politics for populist parties to move in and basically promise easy solutions to difficult problems. This problem that the establishment parties have been able to resolve, if you vote for us, we'll totally solve it. Just give us the power.
That sounds like a scam. Are we all just like more scammable now in some way?
No, I don't think it's necessarily people becoming more scammable. It's just people not trusting the establishment parties. And so the lack of trust creates room for political insurgents, so to speak.
I see. Charming outsiders.
Yeah, the sort of correspondent with the decline in the socioeconomic status quo and that old contract that had existed has been a decline in trust. You know, people have a whole menagerie of different reasons why they think the economy in Europe is stagnating. These are Europeans themselves. And very rarely do they say, you know, it's because we're just not competitive enough. We don't have economies that are nimble enough. It's because we spend too much. Very few people are willing to concede those points. So there's all manner of other boogeymen who are blamed. You know, maybe it's capitalists, maybe it's the Jews, maybe it's immigrants. It's one thing or another. And political parties, populist political parties, thrive on these sorts of alternative explanations because they can run on promising to address them in a way that establishment parties can't, because being establishment parties, they don't really cater to these kinds of conspiracy theories. So it's not really clear how any of this resolves successfully, either in Europe or the United States. It's possible there could be further structural change that results in a new status quo that is inherently stable, or it's possible, equally so, that we just undergo more and more political instability until we end up with authoritarian governments that basically just suppress dissent and force people to accept the new status quo. Trump himself could be effectively doing that. He's not authoritarian, at least not yet, or explicitly, but Trump could be a kind of palliative care for the old order. He could be the guy who is kind of shepherding these people who don't want to accept the changes that have happened in the past 50 years into the new world order, by making them think that there's somebody in office who's actively fighting for them and trying to restore the old status quo. He's not doing that, and he's not even really able to, but he's convinced a huge number of people that he is. And correspondingly, we may be avoiding some of the worst of the political instability that might result if there were not such a leader in power, if there were a leader in power who was trying to maintain the shift in the status quo and the shift towards a new normal, basically the new normal that was augured by the neoliberal order over the past 40, 50 years. So basically, I mean, we've kind of discussed this at length before, but basically when you ask politicians to do something that's impossible, you're asking them to lie to you. Mm-hmm. And effectively, that's what people have voted for the Trump administration, as well as other populist parties and politicians in other countries to do. You know, they don't want to make the difficult trade-offs that would be necessary to reach a new normal, a new stability, a new status quo. And so correspondingly, they're basically just asking politicians to lie to them while the change to a new status quo happens anyway. It's basically just a kind of mass psychosis, mass political theater to augur in a new age that people don't really want but can't really avoid. Mm.
Yeah, there are a lot of outs, too, when it comes to accountability of living up to your promises. If you're running for office, you promise something. If you at least try, you always have the excuse of, oh, it was too hard to change that. Or it took too long, so you couldn't get it done. So there isn't very much accountability, I feel like, for people running for office and then basically doing nothing with it after promising a bunch of really major stuff that people care about.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's just difficult all around. And there's no end in sight. So anyway, that's why I don't think inequality is the reason for populism. It's a contributing factor. It ties into that other stuff I mentioned, but you know, the overarching through line is the decline in traditional forms of economic activity that had been the cornerstone of the old order. Let's see. How important is Mexican-U.S. border trade to the U.S. economy? That's a tough question. Like, important how? Like, just in terms of the size of the US economy, I think US Mexican trade is not all that large a percentage of overall US GDP. I have to probably just fact check that right now. Let's see, 2024, it's about $1 trillion. About $1 trillion in trade between the US and Mexico in 2024. Let's see. So the US economy is like, what is it, $24 trillion now? Let's go 2024. If you want to trust Google's AI here, it's $29.3 trillion. So about 30 now. God damn. 30, so what is that? So 1 trillion is going to be 1/30th of US GDP. So overall bilateral flows are not all that high compared to overall US economic activity. So that said, you could also kind of shift the framing, and instead of focusing on just overall volume, you could look at individual things like prices or impact on return on investment, which of course US companies are going to like. Trade with Mexico is important in so much as there are a lot of agricultural goods that the United States imports from Mexico and does so more cheaply, and in doing so pays less for those goods than it would if they had to pay for them if they were domestically made. So that's very useful, you could say. I don't know that it would be a backbreaker if that trade was disrupted. I don't know how much people are going to riot for guacamole in the United States. But there's other things like beef that are important. The United States produces, I think, most of its own beef, but it actually imports a lot too. And in periods where there's a big drought in the United States that negatively impacts beef production, the U.S. frequently uses Mexican beef as an alternative. And I think that actually happened just recently in 2025, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of beef that comes in from Mexico as kind of an emergency salve in the event that there are shortages in the U.S. So in that sense, in any given year, Mexican beef imports into the U.S. are not that important, but they have the potential to be important. They fulfill a useful role. And beyond that, you could look at, this kind of ties in with return on investment. So a lot of big US companies definitely have boosted their returns and profitability by producing certain labor-intensive items in Mexico. And in so much as that's the case, that is very useful to the US economy. Since otherwise, those companies would probably scale down production, lay off people, etc. Basically, capital would reallocate away from those companies towards others that were getting higher returns. So by maintaining relatively good returns, they were able to maintain investment, remain attractive to investors, and scale up, maintain the jobs they have, and hire more people, which is useful for people in the United States and Mexico. Again, it's a positive sum game. So that's useful corporations, American employees, and also it's useful for American consumers, because as we've talked before, especially last year, most of the cars sold in the United States for the lowest income buyers, basically people who want relatively cheap cars, most of the cars targeting that group are made in Mexico. It is effectively almost mathematically impossible for a car to be made in the United States and for that car to be sold cheaply. It basically can't happen. So like people who want cheap cars in the United States, cheap new cars specifically, effectively can't have them be US made. You basically just can't find those. Almost all of those are either imported from abroad, from Japan or Korea, or alternatively are built in Mexico and then imported in the United States. Mind you, that's not entirely importing the car from Mexico, because the cars made in Mexico are built using American parts. Not all of the parts are American, but a lot of them are. There's multiple parts that'll actually not only cross the border into Mexico to be used as an input, there are actually parts that are made that cross the border multiple times. There are inputs that will be made in the United States and then will be used to make another part in Mexico, and then will be used across the border again to be used to make it an even more complicated part, and then that part will cross over the border again and used as an input into the manufacture of a car in Mexico, whereupon the car moves back across the border into the United States for sale. So is that an American car? Is it a Mexican car? It's kind of both, right? When you have free trade like this, the supply chain gets very intermixed as both parties involved specialize in different parts of the supply chain.
It is both an American and a Mexican car.
Yeah. So is it important for people in the United States to have access to cars that are relatively cheap? Yes, I would argue. I think a lot of people would say yes to that. So if that is something that we want, then yeah, we should absolutely consider trade with Mexico important. By extension, we could consider trade with Korea and Japan important as well, but Mexico is particularly important because unlike a lot of producers in Japan and Korea, producers in Mexico are actually using a lot of American manufactured stuff in the manufacture of those cars rather. So overall, that's good. That's important. Even if the even if the overall amount of bilateral trade between the U.S. and Mexico is a relatively small part of the U.S. overall GDP, it still fulfills useful roles in the U.S. economy, such that we consider trade with Mexico to be useful and important. So those are different ways of answering the question. Just a matter of perspective, basically. Yeah, this is one of the reasons that some strategists in American foreign policy fields have talked about friend-shoring. So rather than reshoring manufacturing capacity from places like China, which kind of has a love-hate relationship with the United States, that's a whole conversation unto itself. Rather than reshoring those those factories to the United States, we could just reshore them to friendly countries like Mexico or Canada or whatever. And even though that means the jobs are not coming back to the United States, we still get the benefit of having the manufacturing happening in a friendly country that is much less likely to cut us off from whatever that factory is producing. Mm-hmm. So it's strategically much better and beneficial. So trade with Mexico could be considered to be beneficial in that way as well. It offers a low-cost manufacturing site that is strategically safer than alternative such potential locations in countries like China.
It's also more geographically optimal because it's a less travel distance.
Yeah. Yeah, much closer, much simpler logistical supply chain. Mm-hmm. I would also point out, just as a additional point, Mexico consumes a whole shit ton of American stuff. So it's not just a matter of supply chains and strategy and guacamole, that kind of stuff. It's also a matter of American exports. Mexico is one of the U.S.'s top export markets. In fact, I think it might even be the top export market. Let me check that. It's easily one of the top ones, regardless. Yeah, Mexico's number one. That's if you don't count the European Union. Mm. If you do count the European Union as a single market, then they're easily the top trade partner. But that's kind of capturing the transatlantic trading relationship. For those of you who don't know this, the transatlantic trading relationship between Europe and the United States is easily the largest on the planet and has been for a long time. People like to talk about the Sino-American trading relationship. That's big, but it's not transatlantic big. Last I checked, the transatlantic trade flow was much bigger.
What are the things that we buy from Europe?
All kinds of shit. Basically, you're tempting me because there's a whole conversation there about trade specialization and I'll try to resist the temptation. Basically, cars, pharmaceuticals, services of a whole variety. Some of it is just fancy foods like French wine, cheeses, geographic specific stuff like Italian type cuisine, basically things that you can only find in Europe. I think there's some chemicals we buy from them as well, beyond just pharmaceuticals. There's certain kinds of refined metals like steel that are bought. Well, let me rephrase that. There are certain kinds of steel, certain grades of steel, and other refined metals that the US imports from Europe. Yeah, there's a whole range of stuff. Yeah, in trade, in economics, trade is obviously like a whole field of study. And one of the things that theorists had kind of expected is that there would be specialization in trade such that most international trade happened between developed economies and developing economies. So by that logic, developing economies would specialize in like raw resources, and then the developed economies would specialize in like manufactured goods. And in turn, by extension, you would not expect then a lot of trade to be happening between developed economies, because they would not hypothetically have much to trade, right? They both would be specializing in like cars and other relatively high-grade, high-quality manufactured goods. And what they found in practice is actually the opposite. Like, most of the trade happens between developed economies. Like, just in terms of scale, it's way bigger. So yes, it's true that developing economies do specialize in like raw resources and whatnot, and they import finished goods from developed economies, but developed economies also trade between themselves. Some of that is just trading, a lot of that actually is just trading the same kinds of stuff they produce. So different kinds of cars, microwaves, like white goods, like dishwashers and stuff. But just like a whole range of manufactured goods that developed economies specialize in, they'll export to each other. And that's not something theorists back in the day, like 100 years ago, had expected. That's kind of an awkward development for a lot of the old models in economics that were developed to kind of model trade like this. And some of it is even actually intra-industry. So there are actually firms, I say intra-industry, but this is also like within firms. There are firms that exist in the United States and that produce in the United States that will import stuff that their subsidiaries in Europe also produce. Sometimes it's complementary to production in the United States, but sometimes they'll just produce stuff in Europe and import it into the US. And that's another aspect to international trade that theorists had not expected. They would have expected that there would be firms specializing in the production of a good, and that they would export it abroad to the developing world, but that these firms would not trade with each other. Certainly not that there would be like an American firm in Europe or European firm in America, and then the different subsidiaries in both trading with each other. But that's what happened. And it's kind of difficult to model correspondingly. So yeah, when you ask like, what does the United States, trade in with Europe, just a whole bunch of stuff. And a lot of it is stuff that we actually just produce here. But it's just different types, different brands, designed for different markets, et cetera. Like firms kind of have a way of stratifying based off of just what they're trying to do and who they're trying to sell to. But again, that's if you want to consider the European Union a single market. If you don't, then Mexico is easily the US's top export market. Well, maybe I shouldn't say easily. I can see Canada here as a close second. So even though Canada and Mexico are not nearly as big as, say, China or Germany or Japan, partly just because of proximity, like their markets end up consuming way more American-made stuff than those other bigger economies do. So if you want to look at the US-Mexico trade and try to measure its quote-unquote importance to the US in terms of its importance to US exporters, then it's very important. So that's another framing that you can use to answer that question. Okay, so let's see. That's another question, knowing how things work. Does folks like Agent Smith and people who know more than I do view Trump more or less as a speed bump? Is there a thought that things will come back to quote unquote normal? Will there be a period of adjustment? Like, what is the path forward after this quote unquote craziness? Yeah, that's the $1 million question. Nobody really knows. Like, is this going to be permanent? Is it going to be like semi-permanent where it's intermittently normal and populist? Or is this just kind of a black swan populist event that kind of goes away? Nobody really knows just what a new equilibrium will really look like. There's lots of different theories. I've talked about a number of my own thoughts on it, but it's all just speculation. Honestly, the real answer is I don't know, and nobody does. Lots of people will try to pretend that they do. There's lots of bullshit out there confidently predicting what's going to happen like 20, 30 years from now. But long-term forecasting is, basically like astrology. It's basically just as accurate and often based off of evidence that's just as spurious. Yeah, anybody's guess.
Our priorities are changing over time somewhat as well. It's not a fast process, but there is a glacial generational change in priorities. And I think one of the examples that comes to mind that is really difficult for older generations to relate to is 6-7. And how 6-7 for the youngest generation is sort of a battle cry, or it's a thing that you say with people socially to be included and to be funny. It doesn't really have intrinsic meaning on its own, but we ascribe meaning to things. So over time, new things will matter to us that didn't matter in the past, and we can't really anticipate those. So who will be the people who run for office in 15 or 20 years? We don't fucking know. We'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the ideas I've floated before on here is that this populist moment could play out like previous populist moments in U.S. history. And that basically involved the populist movement kind of merging with establishment political forces, forming coalitions with them, and then becoming the new establishment. And that would involve trade-offs where some things the populists wanted they would get, other things they would give up, and there would be a kind of give and take, a quid pro quo that would result in a stable new political equilibrium. That's basically what happened with the agrarian movement in the United States back in the late 1800s, which we've kind of touched on before. They basically entered into an alliance with urban progressives to create the New Deal coalition under FDR in the 1930s. And that sort of became the cornerstone of a new political stability in the United States that lasted for several decades. So Europe's history with populism is a little more fraught. The United States, for its ills, never kind of spontaneously and systematically annihilated all of its unpopular minorities in one go. So I'm not really sure how populism in Europe pans out. That could be much more colorful than in the United States, potentially. I would like to think that Europe will handle it in a similar way to the way I just described how it might happen in the United States, where there's just kind of a give and take, a quid pro quo, and then eventually a new consensus can kind of emerge, kind of new united coalition that incorporates populists and other political actors, which maintains all of the best aspects of the status quo while also introducing new concessions that appeases the discontented and those who have otherwise been disadvantaged by changes that have happened structurally in society over the past half century. That's the ideal anyway. We'll see what happens in practice. So, that's one forecast. Yeah, again, there's any number of ways it could go. I kind of want to talk about how the U.S. economy could be evolved, but that's kind of outside the ambit of the question, so I'll restrain myself. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't know is the best answer I can give to that. I can give you a whole bunch of different hypotheses and other potential outcomes, but just honestly, all of that would be speculation. So we can talk about it if you want to, but otherwise, my answer is I don't know. Let's see. Mayor Mamdani acknowledged the Armenian genocide, and this seems to have upset Turkish relations. Can you provide more information as to why this is controversial? Oh boy. Yeah, the Armenian genocide has been kind of a running thorn in the side of Turkey's relations with any and every country that has even a moderately sized Armenian minority. Because Turkish nationalists, I don't know how much like the questioner here knows about the Armenian genocide, but basically, I mean, the Cliff Notes version is that the Ottoman government during World War I did not trust its Armenian minority because they were Christian, among other reasons, and so rather than risk them potentially rising up and assisting an invader, especially potentially Russia, they just kind of wiped them out. And that was a problem for Turkey's foreign policy then and ever since, because there was a large Armenian diaspora outside of the Ottoman Empire. And everybody outside of the empire was obviously very upset about it. You know, all of the Armenians outside of the empire were very upset about the genocide for obvious reasons. But there was also a fair amount of upset even beyond the Armenian diaspora, because a lot of Christian countries did not appreciate the systematic murder of what they saw as their co-religionists. Basically, Christians were upset about the murdering of Christians. And so some Christian activists took issue with it and tried to pressure their representatives in, say, the US government and also some European democratic governments to do something about it, to kind of pressure the Turkish government to recognize it, to stop it, and to basically compensate for it to some degree. Although I don't think it was ever clear how they were exactly going to do that. But since then, even after the genocide happened, decades, generations, even later, even up till this day, the Armenian diaspora in the United States and in other countries has insisted and demanded that the Turkish government recognize what happened as a genocide and take steps to kind of reach some kind of catharsis. I guess I would point out here, in addition, the Turkish government has never recognized the Armenian genocide as a genocide. I think they do recognize that it happened, that there were many ethnic Armenians who died during World War I, but they don't recognize it as some kind of systematic effort by the Turkish government at the time to wipe them out. And that's kind of the point of contention, because historians and the Armenian diaspora, among other parties involved, to varying degrees, all recognize it as an explicit example of genocide. In fact, one of the first big genocides in the 20th century, but the Turkish government is not having it. So for about 100 years now, actually, we're probably past the 100th anniversary now. For more than 100 years now, successive Turkish governments have made it their business to refuse to recognize it as a genocide. That's just been a core plank in Turkish foreign policy for generations now. And there's no sign of it changing anytime soon.
Doesn't it only cost them pride to admit that they did something wrong?
Yep. It's a domestic political thing. You know, the most influential and powerful political bloc in Turkish politics has always been Turkish nationalists. In fact, the political spectrum in Turkey is basically just different grades of nationalist. There's not really a strong anti-nationalist or internationalist cohort in that political spectrum. And Turkish nationalists just kind of reject any kind of political narrative that undermines their core message of political unity in Turkey. From their perspective, everybody in Turkey is Turkish, and there is no significant effort or event that would suggest otherwise, and the Turkish genocide is among them. Sorry, not the Armenian genocide that they don't recognize as a genocide is among them. You know, they say there was some bad shit that happened back then, but it wasn't a systematic genocide, and everything is fine now.
What did they say that it was?
They just say that there was an effort by the Ottoman government to relocate Armenian communities, and that it was done in a haphazard way that resulted in the deaths of many Armenians. Basically, they kind of treat it like their version of the Trail of Tears in the United States. Mm-hmm. The US government wasn't explicitly trying to kill them, but it mishandled the populations it was relocating to the point where effectively it amounted to mass killing. Mm. So that's sort of the Turkish government's framing, roughly speaking. It's wrong because, like, it's documented that there was a systematic effort to wipe them out. Like, it was purposely done. The relocations were purposely done in a way that left them vulnerable to violence, not only from the state, but also to various militias in the Ottoman Empire, as well as local security forces to just arbitrarily kill them, steal their shit, etc. So it was done purposefully, but the Turkish government does not recognize that. In fact, they reject the logic on its face. So it's not that big a deal in foreign policy. Like, if countries don't want to recognize a genocide, that's not really other countries' business per se. Like, most countries are just going to be interested in economic ties and security ties. Anything else is mostly just going to be theater for a domestic political audience. And over time, the Christian impetus, the Christian activists who had pressured the Turkish government abroad to try to get them to recognize it as a genocide and to take measures to compensate, that kind of faded with time. I don't think there's like a big Christian constituency in the United States or even elsewhere that pushes for that. So at this point, it's just the Armenian diaspora, at least as I understand it. And they're not a meaningful political demographic in the United States. I don't think they ever really were. But occasionally they do kind of pop up in individual municipalities or, local elections as a relevant political force. And so correspondingly, their representatives sometimes feel the need to voice their community's desire for this recognition to happen on the part of the Turkish government. But because this generally happens locally, maybe at most like a representative, one or two representatives in the House of Representatives at the federal level, and then maybe some representatives at a state level, and then obviously some city representatives at a municipal level will kind of voice this opinion. But as far as I know, it's never been operationalized in actual American foreign policy. At most, like a government in the US will complain about it briefly, and then it disappears again. So there's a kind of kabuki theater that happens wherein the US government will complain about it, and then the Turkish government will reject it, and then everything goes back to normal. Neither side really expects the other to either stop complaining about it on the American side or to actually recognize it as a genocide on the Turkish side. So everybody does the little dance on the behalf of different domestic political constituencies, and then it goes away until the next kabuki theater.
I see.
So that's what Mamdani is doing. He's doing the theater. He may or may not himself actually believe that the Turkish government needs to recognize the Armenian genocide as a genocide. But regardless, the reason he's doing this here, calling them out and doing this, he's doing it on behalf of Armenian voters in New York City. I would point out that there is some non-Armenian pressure in the United States for the Turkish government to recognize the genocide as a genocide, and that is some parts of the progressive left. So kind of in the same way that Christian activists back in the day kind of sympathized with the Armenians for being Christians and wanted to help them out, even though Christians in the United States didn't really have a direct linkage to the Armenians killed in the genocide. There is a similar phenomenon now where progressive activists who do not have a direct stake in it kind of sympathize with the Armenians and want to help them out. In this case, it's more just general sympathy for an oppressed minority. So there is some broader progressive support for this pressure. And New York City has a lot of progressives, and so it's kind of stronger there than it is in other parts of the United States. So I think that's what Mamdani is doing here. He's catering to the Armenian diaspora and to the cohort within the progressive left in New York City that is invested in this issue. Well, that's all we had for questions.
Very good. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for helping with questions this week.
Much appreciated. We still haven't gotten to Iran, so we could do that next if you want.
Sure. Sounds good to me. We have
Yeah,
about
it'll be pretty-
25 minutes left.
Gotcha.
You said you said it was going to be shorter than usual.
Yeah, it'll be quick and clean this week. It'll be even shorter than last week, actually. Yeah, not a whole lot happening, so not much to get through. Well, I guess for starters, the ceasefire negotiations are ongoing. There's a lot of posturing and bullshitting going on, and it's basically impossible to read as an outsider, especially given that one of the negotiators is Trump and his administration, and he's famously mercurial. So that makes it especially difficult to interpret what the fuck is going on. So the news I have on that front is that Pakistan convinced Trump to extend the ceasefire for 2 weeks. The deadline for the 2-week ceasefire agreed before was coming up. Pakistanis successfully talked them into extending it. So we've got a nominal 2 weeks ahead of us where the US will not be bombing Iran and vice versa. It's not entirely clear how this happened. Both Iranian and the US governments here had been very reluctant to agree to anything. Like, the talks have not been going great from what I've read. But the Pakistanis have been playing mediator, and they're kind of playing their own angle here. They do want to be a neutral party and to try to mediate a deal, but they also have an interest in the Strait of Hormuz opening because they do import some stuff. So they do have an interest in the talks reaching some kind of successful conclusion. So I imagine there's some truth to the idea that the Pakistanis themselves may have been the one who really pushed the hardest for an extension. But it could be that the Iranians obviously don't want to get bombed, so there's an incentive there to try to at least get the ceasefire continuing, even if they can't reach like some kind of final resolution. And the Trump administration is hard to read, but I kind of infer that they're looking for an exit. I don't really think they want the war to continue on much longer. They, as we discussed before, probably thought it would have ended very quickly.
Yeah, it's not even war profiteering. It's burning money and making stuff worse for you and everyone else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it seemed like you've said that in the past, whoever last spoke to Trump has basically the most sway over him.
Yeah.
So if someone gave him a good pitch that he can do another flashy Venezuela thing, in and out, it'll look impressive. The U.S. military is going to look very competent. You're going to look very strong and decisive. If they pitch it to him like that, I feel like he's going to give that an easy yes, even though he doesn't really understand. Like, what if it goes wrong? What if these things don't go according to plan? What if Iran was hoping we would do this so they can do that instead? Like, if there's someone who pitches it well enough, you could greenlight almost anything.
Yeah, that's almost certainly what happened. I would guess Netanyahu talked him into it, but I'm sure there's other actors within his administration, if not also in broader American politics, that probably also contributed. So the Trump administration is framing their agreement to extend the ceasefire 2 weeks as giving Iran a chance to form a proposal, which is weird, but okay, sure. So the other news in the ceasefire negotiations has to do with Lebanon. There was some disagreement about whether the initial ceasefire agreement covered Lebanon. The Iranians said yes. The Israelis said no. Trump said yes, but then changed his mind to no. And so fighting in Lebanon continued between Hezbollah and Israel in spite of the ceasefire. And that, of course, contributed to the Iranian government maintaining their closure of the Strait of Hormuz. So then last week, we discussed how there was an agreement made that did cover Lebanon, a new ceasefire specifically between Hezbollah and Israel. And there was some question about whether or not that would last, whether or not it would become a part of the overarching negotiation, etc. So what happened over the past week is that that ceasefire nominally held for a few days, but then the Israelis found excuses to break it. They said Hezbollah was trying to smuggle weapons and people into the DMZ that they were setting up. Hezbollah retaliated, and so there actually was a rising tide of fighting over the course of the past week. And then in the past few days, the Israelis basically said that the ceasefire was over. They said that they would begin targeting Hezbollah targets in Lebanon again. Vigorously, I believe, is the word they used.
Oh.
So the Lebanon ceasefire has collapsed. That is the takeaway there. This was kind of weird because the announcement that it collapsed happened, I think, less than 24 hours after it was announced that the ceasefire in Lebanon would be extended 3 weeks. So the ceasefire was announced in Lebanon. It seemed to falter. A 3-week extension was announced, and then its total collapse occurred.
Cool.
Kind of an odd sequence of events. So we'll see how this affects the talks between the US and Iran. I'm sure the Iranians will demand that there be an end to fighting between Hezbollah and Israel, and that Israel withdraw from Lebanon. Presumably that will complicate talks considerably, because the Israeli government is going to be dead set opposed to doing any of that. As far as the US blockade, that continues unabated. There have been some ships that supposedly have slipped through, but the US government insists that it has successfully deterred several dozen ships from entering the strait. Donald Trump, for his part, said the US was in, quote, total control over the Strait of Hormuz, end quote. And he also said that the US Navy would, quote, shoot and kill any boat laying mines there, end quote. Make of that what you will. I don't read too much into that. Seems like more posturing to me. Excuse me, I had to sneeze.
You're excused. Sneeze when you will.
Okay, where were we? Okay, so on to the international section. So some countries in Europe have agreed to widen sanctions against Iran. Specifically, they're going to sanction some of the individuals within the Iranian government supposedly responsible for blocking the Strait of Hormuz. And they also announced that they're going to expand a potential naval mission in the Middle East. This is the same one that they discussed a couple weeks ago. Basically, this would involve a European naval mission to the Strait of Hormuz designed to keep it open that would deploy after current hostilities in the Strait of Hormuz end. So they're happy to keep the strait open so long as there's no fighting there, keeping it closed. Kind of a mirror image of the European position on Ukraine. They're happy to deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine to maintain the peace so long as there's no fighting happening there. Mm-hmm. I kind of interpret this as more of a European nominal concession designed to pacify the Trump administration. I don't even know if this will actually end up even happening. This could be them just trying to give Trump a favorable headline. Lots of countries have figured out that this is a good way to deal with Trump and his pressure. Just give him a pretend victory and hope he goes away. It works more often than not. It works more often than not.
Trump visited our country and gave us an awesome deal, and we are very thankful for Trump and his amazing deal. And he's like, aha, I got them.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. It's happened pretty frequently, almost exactly like that. So beyond the sanctions, there was also some NATO drama. Supposedly, there was a leak of a Pentagon report that was supposedly looking for ways to punish allies in NATO for not sufficiently supporting the Trump administration's conflict with Iran. And NATO responded to that by announcing that by reminding that there is no provision in the alliance to expel members. Supposedly, the report also involved the US government looking for a way to suspend Spain's membership. Spain's government in particular has been very resistant to being involved in the Iran conflict. A lot of countries in Europe have been reluctant to get involved, but generally they still allow the US military to use assets and bases in their territory to help basically as part of the operations ongoing in the Middle East. Spain has not even allowed that. They're not just refusing to get involved with the conflict themselves, they're refusing to allow the US military to use its assets in Spain. So that's why the Trump administration has focused disproportionately on Spain when it whines about this. And supposedly, this came way out of left field for me. So the US government, as part of this effort to punish allies, is apparently also looking at ending recognition of the Falkland Islands as a part of the UK.
What?
The US position, yeah, the US position has long been a kind of ambiguous position, not explicitly recognizing it as part of the UK or Argentina, but in general, we've treated it as though it's part of the UK. So supposedly they're looking at possibly not doing that, becoming more ambiguous, or maybe even recognizing Argentina's claim. So all of this just because of a supposed lack of support in Iran, or in the Strait of Hormuz vis-a-vis Iran. This kind of feels like more theater to me, so this could end up just being more kayfabe drama. We'll see. And then the final item here, supposedly an Iranian cell of potential terrorists was arrested in the UAE. Supposedly they're linked to Iran, and they were called the Guardianship of the Islamic Jurist, or Vilayat-e-Faqih. I'm butchering that pronunciation for sure. So that's the latest and thus far, I think, maybe only evidence that there are terrorist cells beyond Iran waiting to be activated. There's a lot of talk about that as a potential tool Iran could use to deter aggression against it. But they've undergone and suffered quite a bit of aggression over the past year and change, and they haven't activated them. So it could be that they're just holding them in reserve, but I suspect maybe this is evidence that they either don't exist or they exist in such a limited capacity that they can't realistically be used here for significant offensive operations. And that's it. That's the Iran update.
It just made me think of one of the previous stories you've told us of there were some terrorists who were trying to set off some bombs, and the bombs went off early in their own vehicles and stuff, and they kind of blew themselves up before getting to their desired target. It just made me think of like, terrorism is hard. If you're trying to actually be effective, it's dangerous, it's illegal, no one likes that you're doing that. You have to be sneaky and effective. And there are really strong entities like government agencies, militaries, like these are much larger scale operations than yours. So it kind of goes back to that same question that we've been asking recently, which is, what is your win condition? Are you actually wounding this foe, or are you just harassing yourself or harassing them and being annoying, but you're sacrificing human capital? Human lives are valuable, so to do terrorist stuff is like trading out your units intentionally, as opposed to trying to conserve your units and do a military operation where you intend to keep all of your troops alive. Not to mention the ethics of all this.
I actually turned the stopwatch on my phone on when we started so that I wouldn't pester you with questions about time.
Ah, interesting. I was wondering why you hadn't asked yet.
Yeah, that's why I kind of had this off in the corner.
Normally you ask me how we're doing on time about an hour and a half in. So we were 2.5 hours in. I was like, he's just in a groove. He doesn't care. That's cool.
I kind of felt guilty for always bugging you about it, so I thought I'd try to take the initiative here.
I appreciate that.
I'll try to remember for next time.
It's okay. It wasn't a pet peeve of mine or anything, so if you do happen to ask or forget, I probably will not be cross with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your leniency.
Cheers. You've been lovely on this show for us for many years now.
God, it has been many, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we started 17, right? 2017.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Gosh.
9 years. We've had recent win in the sales. Something about the Twitch algorithm changed, or I'm being embedded somewhere because it's been consistently saying that we have like 400 viewers almost every stream. So that's been cool. The chat has been moving faster, so I'm not sure if that just because I'm higher in listings, more people are chatting as well, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. Chat's like, don't question it. Just you're a good streamer. Like, okay, okay.
Yeah. Take the W, I guess.
Yeah, I'm just a little bit hesitant to assume that any rise in viewership stays because there was a period when StarCraft, speaking of the skin collections, they were doing war chests for StarCraft 2. And I got to help promote these. And people could unlock skins by watching Twitch streams for a certain amount of time. So even if you didn't normally watch StarCraft streamers, you could watch StarCraft streamers and then get a skin or two. So I got a whole bunch of viewers who were basically farming those unlocks, and I had 1,000 viewer average for basically the duration of the event. And I started to self-identify as a streamer of that bracket of like I'm 1,000 viewer streamer now, and I felt that, and you feel proud of yourself and you feel like you've ascended to a new tier. But then after those promotions ended and then Blizzard's team gets cut and there's a lot of just kind of general decline in the enthusiasm around StarCraft because it's not getting updates, my viewership kind of went down to a more reasonable level that fit my community better. But that was kind of soul crushing at first, where it felt like, did I do something wrong to not retain these viewers? But that was just a temporary spike that you had.
Hmm.
And another thing, too, financially speaking, with something as volatile as stream work, you will at certain seasons get way more support than others. So if you ever get a really surplus couple months or even a year, you shouldn't assume that that's going to be your money next year because I'm not salaried. What I make is dependent upon the individual consumers being enthusiastic about the content. And that can vary. It varies based on what game I play. It varies based on what like hype events are happening that year around me that cause me to have a boost or not. Like there was a funny one with the Brunt videos. I made a whole bunch of Brunt videos for warrior tanking and World of Warcraft. And it was something that I was passionate about. I was leading the guild, main tanking for the guild. Very fun journey, very time consuming journey. I made a ton of videos, made almost no money off of Brunt. It wasn't something that took off for me like some of the big WoW streamers have. And that's fine. But since TBC got relaunched, I've had a whole bunch of people messaging me on Discord, popping in the Twitch chat, and commenting on YouTube that they're watching those videos again. So, if anything, it's a labor of love that people have benefited from, and a lot of people appreciate it. So, that's very cool. So, I try to find satisfaction in the enjoyment of the content, in people's like genuine entertainment, rather than to be too lost in the sea of metrics. Because if you're too much in the sea of metrics, then sometimes you're chasing the numbers more than you're acknowledging the people. And this size of community is particularly nice because we don't have a completely out of hand, just spammed chat. If you get up into that thousands of viewers on Twitch range, the chats are almost always really spammy and really noisy to the point that you can't have a normal conversation. But in this stream, we have that nice viewer amount where you can have a complete sentence, you can have a paragraph. People will read your paragraph and respond to your paragraph. And sometimes the streamer even sees it too. So there's almost like you don't want to grow too much because then you could lose yourself and lose that community that you have. But it would be a form of suffering from success, which is, it's good in its own way. Yeah, chat's pointing out that WoW is kind of boring to watch. I agree with that. The big WoW streamers who are successful are either people who have been involved in the game forever and they know everything about it, or they're personality streamers who make a living by talking about a bunch of stuff, like Asmongold. It's more about his ability to speak about random stuff that people find entertaining than specifically his WoW gameplay. So me raiding on stream is not particularly engaging. In fact, it's the opposite of engaging because I'm willfully ignoring chat to prioritize the success of the active raid that's happening. Because our raid leader is making calls, I'm executing the polls, and I'm trying to do that well rather than to try to prioritize comedy on my channel while the raid is happening. So it's interesting, but nice success recently. And thank you, chat, for your enthusiasm.
I'm looking at your flags.
See anything interesting?
There's more of them than usual.
Mm.
I guess that makes sense since it's an elevated viewer count.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much the usual suspects, though. Oh, there's Bolivia. I don't think I've seen Bolivia on here before.
Nice.
So thanks for watching from Bolivia, whoever you are.
You have to do something to opt in to share some of your like user stats, like what country you're watching from. So this isn't comprehensive of all the viewers who are there. But yeah, we see one from South Africa, one from Serbia, one from Netherlands, one from Mexico, one from Japan, one from Finland, one from the UK, one from Israel, one from Belarus.
Yep, I've seen Belarus on here before.
They have a Belarusian regular. Cool. 2 from Ukraine. 2 from Russia. It listed as Russian Federation and not Russia. Weird.
Well, Russian Federation is technically correct, so I guess it makes sense. They actually have the full names of some of these on here. Like if you look at Bolivia, it was the plural national nation of Bolivia.
2 from Turkey, 2 from Denmark. No, we always have some German regulars.
There's one Austria as well.
2 from New Zealand, 3 from Australia.
There's one Argentina. Is that Dagnip? Is he here, or is this somebody else?
Might be. We see in chat, hi from Russia, UK. Am I playing both Dota and SE2 these days? Yes, I am. It's more Dota than Starcraft, but still Starcraft for like 4 to 5 days of the week. I try to stack the Starcraft on the weekends more so, because many Dota players, they don't play during the week, and then they play drunk on the weekend. So it just feels like you're going into a dive bar for your Dota team. As opposed to during the week, you've got a few more like working professionals who play Dota on the side as a passion project. You get some level of integrity. There's not an explanation of the shift from SC2 to Dota. It's more of a slide in passion toward the goal of reaching Immortal in Dota. Is very fun. With SC2, I don't have a next obvious goal aside from assigning myself an MMR number and then shooting for that. So it's got relatively less novelty and excitement for me. So I don't feel I'm learning at as fast of a rate, but I do acknowledge that the level of my content with StarCraft is higher because my gameplay level is higher. I can play shitty StarCraft for my skill, and I'm still in the top 0.5% of players and what they can do. So there's a lot of value in what people can watch and learn from seeing the StarCraft play. Whereas the Dota play, I think I'm in like the 85th percentile or something right now. So definitely a higher level player, but not a pro level player, and not pro adjacent either. But it's quite a grind. I'm enjoying it a lot.
2 in Taiwan. What's been happening in Taiwan recently? Like, what's the big news item there, other than politics? Like, what's a big thing that's happened in Taiwan unrelated to politics in the past couple weeks? Almost everything I read about Taiwan in the news has to do with either mainland China or the trading relationship with the United States. I hardly ever read anything else. So I'm kind of curious for like a slice of life view of what's got people's attention there.
Mm.
Oh, got one Israel, two Ukraine, a couple Brazilians. Yeah, pretty good spread. You do well. You got fans all over Neuro.
Yeah, to be Zerg is beyond one's nationality. We've created new tribes for ourselves. I feel like that's one of the healthy outlets for human tribalism. We want to think about teams. We want to think about our people, whoever those are. But if you do the our people thing too hardcore for ethnicities, that's what's racist, right? But if you do it too hardcore for sports, that's European football fans. You've got to figure out a healthy way to be a part of a tribe. So we have a Zerg tribe with Dota. I guess we have like our favorite heroes, but it's not quite the same. I guess Horde and Alliance in World of Warcraft is also a manufactured tribe. I'm more of a Horde player than an Alliance player, but it doesn't feel as visceral to me of a loyalty as I do for Zerg.
Didn't you play Protoss for a while?
I started out as Protoss
That's what
in
it
Starcraft.
was. Okay.
Yeah, I thought they looked very cool. And Zerg, the mechanics are a little bit unusual for an RTS. Normally you're just creating buildings, but Zerg is operating based on larvae and eggs morphing into stuff, and then units morphing into buildings, which is not the usual way that we construct things as humans.
Well, was there anything else you wanted to get to? Something you wanted to finish on?
I don't think I had a major standout thing. I highly recommend cardio before trying to do cognitively difficult tasks, like just having some exercise where you're getting fresh air, you're stretching your legs, you're elevating your heart rate even a little bit from walking. Running, I think, is more effective for this, but elevating the heart rate a little bit, it makes the rest of the day feel like you have a faster pace relative to the world. But if you roll out of bed after browsing on your phone for a while, there's like a grogginess that never comes off. But if you engage your body, you engage that kind of hunter-gatherer set of equipment, then you're a lot sharper when it comes to cognitive tasks as well. Even if your work is sitting at a computer doing stuff, your mental acuity seems to go up. And also, I've noticed my enthusiasm is a lot higher. Yeah, chat calling it sleep inertia. I feel that for sure. Sometimes it hits really hard because I play hyper aggressive competitive games like Dota and Starcraft, and you have that sleep inertia. You queue into a match, and someone is just very aggressive and violent from the very start, and it takes you completely off guard because you're in a very cozy and relaxed state because you just woke up and you're still kind of in that mindset. But if you go for a run, you're much more in the fight or flight category. Your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are doing stuff. Your brain is firing on all cylinders at that point. So that's been one of the observations I've made since I've gotten involved into running regularly again.
Good advice.
Yeah. Another trick that you can use to boost your focus is splashing water on your face. The mammalian dive reflex is basically a surge of energy and focus that you get that happens if you were to be submerged in water, because humans would, over time, die if they stay underwater. And you can replicate this if you have cold water from your sink and you splash it on your face a couple times. Your body kind of invigorates itself and readies for a survival task when you can just go do something mental and use that spike in focus to your advantage.
Huh. Interesting. I never would have thought.
Mm-hmm.
It's splashing face with water. Neat.
Yep.
I did exercise today, by the way.
Oh, what'd you do?
I didn't do the walk, actually, because I missed my window yesterday because I was running around doing chores. And then today I forgot. So I just did some exercise in my room. Some light calisthenics, a little bit of jogging, running, what have you.
Very good. You have my full support, sire. Well, we'll try to continue with it. I haven't been running as much recently because it's been snowing a bunch. I slipped and twisted my ankle once at UTD because I was like, I'm going to run in the snow. It's going to be so fun. Slips on ice, twists ankle pretty bad, limps back. Ouch. I learned a lesson.
That's rough.
Yep. But that's okay. With age comes wisdom. I firmly believe that the 30s can be a lot better than the 20s because you can cut out a bunch of the dumb shit that you learned the hard way. You can't convince a teenager to actualize life lessons. The teenager has to grow into a 20-year-old, has to do dumb shit for 10 years, and then figure out how to live more efficiently and elegantly for what they want.
That's how it is.
Mm-hmm.
Been that way for as long as there's been people to do it like that.
Mm-hmm.
I should probably get through the learning phase at some point.
Well, you learn plenty. The question is where you specialize it.
There you go.
Well, very good, sir. Thank you, Chad, for hanging out this evening. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for handling questions. And thank you, Agent Smith, for your time. And we'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.